Abigail Whitmore stood frozen on the porch, clutching a suitcase held shut with rope, while her own brother laughed and told her she was nothing but a joke nobody wanted to keep. 27 years old, and her family had finally found someone desperate enough to take her off their hands, a lonely mountain rancher 300 miles away. She didn't know that the man waiting for her would look at her the way no one ever had in her whole life. Before we begin, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled tonight. Say it again, Abigail said. Say it to my face, Silas, and not behind my back like you always do. Silas Whitmore did not even have the decency to stop grinning. He leaned against the porch post with his thumbs hooked in his belt, the way their father used to stand, though their father had never once looked at Abigail like she was something to be swept off the property. "I already said it," Silas answered. "Ain't my fault the truth stings." Cora, his wife, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her apron, and she did not defend Abigail either. She only sighed the way a person sighs at a chore they've been putting off too long. "It's for the best, Abby," Cora said. "You know it is. You can't stay here forever eating off Silas's table and doing nothing but mending. A woman your age with no husband and no prospects, it ain't right. It ain't natural." "I do plenty," Abigail said, and her voice cracked despite her trying to hold it steady. "I tend the garden. I salt the meat. I raised Jonah's boy near half his life while the rest of you were too busy to—" "That ain't the same as a husband," Silas cut in. "That ain't the same as a woman making her own way. You think any man in this county's gonna come knocking for you? Look at you, Abby." He said it plain, like he was commenting on the weather. "Look at you, Abby." As if her face were a debt she owed the family a mark against the Whitmore name that needed settling. Abigail had heard those words in one shape or another since she was 12 years old, since the barn dance, where Llewellyn Briggs had laughed behind her hand and called her a heifer, dressed up for slaughter, and every boy in earshot had laughed along, because that was easier than defending a girl nobody thought was worth defending. She had carried that laughter for 15 years. She had carried it into every room she'd ever walked into, waiting for it to happen again, and it always did. In smaller ways, quieter ways, but it always did. "I never asked you to find me a husband," she said. "No," Jonah said, coming around the side of the house with a folded letter in his hand. He was the younger brother, and crueler for being weaker, he needed Silas's approval too badly to ever contradict him. "You never asked. But somebody's got to think of your future, Abby, on account of you sure ain't thinking of it yourself." "What is that?" Abigail said, looking at the letter. "A rancher," Jonah said. "Up in Montana Territory, man by the name of Thornton. Got himself a spread up in the mountains, no wife, no woman to keep his house. Preacher Coleman knows him through his cousin. Man's desperate for help, desperate enough. He don't much care what he's getting, so long as she can cook and keep a house and not run off screaming at the first sight of hard work." The words landed on Abigail like stones. "Desperate enough, he don't much care what he's getting." "You already wrote to him?" she said. It wasn't a question. She could see it in the way Jonah wouldn't meet her eyes, in the way Cora had gone very still and very interested in a thread on her apron. 3 weeks ago, Silas admitted. "Got his answer back yesterday. He'll take you. Sight unseen. Says he don't need a beauty, just a woman who'll work and won't complain." Abigail felt something break loose in her chest, something that had been held together by sheer stubbornness for a very long time. "You sold me," she said. "Like a horse, like a piece of furniture you couldn't fit in the wagon." "Nobody sold you," Cora said sharply. "Don't be dramatic." "Then what do you call it?" Nobody answered her. That was answer enough. "The stage leaves at dawn," Silas said, straightening off the post. "You'll take it to the rail line, then the train carries you the rest of the way to a town called Amber Creek. Thornton's man will meet you there. And if I refuse—" Silas's face went cold in a way that reminded her unpleasantly of their father in his worst moods. "Then you can walk yourself off this property tonight and see how far 27 years of being nobody's favorite gets you in this world alone. Your choice, Abby, always has been." It wasn't a choice at all, and they all knew it. A woman alone in this territory had exactly 2 futures dependent on family who resented her, or dependent on a stranger who might resent her less. Abigail looked at her brother, at the man who shared her mother's eyes and none of her mother's kindness, and she understood with a terrible clarity that she had already lost this argument before it began. She had lost it 15 years ago at a barn dance. She had lost it every day since, in small cruelties disguised as honesty. "Fine," she said. "I'll go." "Good," Silas said, already turning away, already finished with her. "Pack light. Man like that won't have room for foolishness." That night, Abigail sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room that had been hers since childhood, folding what little she owned into a suitcase that had belonged to her mother. 2 dresses, a shawl, a small wooden box that held her mother's hairpins, the only inheritance anyone had thought to leave her. She held the box in her lap for a long moment, running her thumb over the carved lid, and she let herself cry the way she hadn't allowed in front of Silas or Cora or Jonah, quiet, controlled, the kind of crying a woman does when she has learned that loud grief only invites more laughter. "You're not nothing," she whispered to herself, the way she had whispered it 1,000 times before, not quite believing it, needing to say it anyway. "You're not nothing, Abigail Whitmore." She did not sleep. When the stage rattled up the lane before dawn, she was already dressed, already standing on the porch with her suitcase in hand, and no one came out to say goodbye, except Jonah's boy, 6 years old, who threw his arms around her waist and asked if she was coming back. "Not for a while, sweet pea," she told him, and kissed the top of his head, and did not let herself look back at the house as the stage pulled away. The journey took the better part of a week. The jolting stage to the rail line, the long, clattering train ride north and west, mile after mile of country growing wilder and higher and lonelier the further she went. Abigail spent most of it with her forehead against the window glass, watching the flat plains give way to hills and the hills give way to something that could only be called mountains. Great blue-shadowed shapes rising up out of the earth like the world itself had decided to stop pretending to be gentle. She thought about the letter. Desperate enough he don't much care what he's getting. She turned the phrase over and over until it lost its shape, until it became just sound, and still it hurt every single time. An older woman sat across from her for the last leg of the journey, a widow named Mrs. Pruitt, traveling to see her daughter in Helena, and she was kind in the unthinking way of strangers who have nothing invested in your feelings. "You look like a woman heading towards something she's dreading," Mrs. Pruitt said. "That obvious. Honey, you've been wringing that handkerchief for 2 hours straight." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes were not unkind. "Marriage." "Something like it," Abigail said. "My family arranged it. A rancher I've never met." "Ah." Mrs. Pruitt nodded slowly, like she'd seen this particular story before, in one form or another, dozens of times. "And you're frightened he won't want you when he sees you." Abigail's throat tightened. "My family made sure to tell him not to expect much." "Well," Mrs. Pruitt said, and there was something almost fierce in the way she said it. "Then he's the one who ought to be worried, isn't he? Seems to me any man who agrees to marry a woman he's never laid eyes on, based on nothing but a letter and a promise, she'll work hard. That's not a man who's chasing beauty, dear. That's a man who's chasing something a good deal more useful than a pretty face. Don't you go handing him your worth before he's even had the chance to see it for himself." Abigail didn't answer, but she held on to those words for the rest of the journey, the way she'd held on to her mother's hairpin box carefully, like something that might break if she gripped it too hard, like something she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. The train let her off at a small depot in a town called Amber Creek, a scattering of clapboard buildings pressed up against the base of the mountains, and Abigail stood on the platform with her suitcase and her mother's box, and felt entirely, completely alone. She had been told a man would meet her. She scanned the handful of people on the platform, a station master, 2 boys hauling crates, an old man asleep on a bench, and found no one who seemed to be looking for anyone. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. A man stood a few feet away, tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a plain work shirt and dust-colored trousers hat in his hands, rather than on his head. He had dark hair, a jaw shadowed with a few days' growth, and eyes the color of strong coffee, steady and unhurried, in a way that made Abigail immediately aware of how her own hands were trembling. Yes," she said. "Abigail Whitmore. Caleb Thornton." He extended a hand, and when she took it, his grip was careful, like he was handling something he didn't want to bruise. "Sorry for the wait. Horse threw a shoe halfway here, and I had to walk him the last mile." Abigail waited for it. The pause, the flicker in his eyes. The moment men always had, the half-second where their expression rearranged itself from expectation to disappointment before they remembered their manners. It didn't come. Caleb Thornton looked at her the way he might look at anyone, plainly, directly, without apology and without appraisal, and then he reached down and picked up her suitcase, like it weighed nothing at all. "Wagon's this way, ma'am," he said. "You must be tired from the ride. There's a boarding house here in town. Does a decent supper if you'd rather eat before we start out. It's a fair piece yet to the ranch." "I know. No, thank you. I'd rather just go if that's all right." "That's fine by me." He glanced at her, and there was something careful in the look, something that read less like judgment and more like a man trying to gauge the weather before a long ride. "You've had a hard few days. I can see it on you." "You don't know anything about my few days, Mr. Thornton." The words came out sharper than she intended, defensive, braced for the sting that always followed. But Caleb only nodded unbothered and set her suitcase in the bed of the wagon. "No, ma'am, I don't," he said. "But I know what a person looks like when they've been made to feel small by folks who ought to have known better. Seen it plenty. Don't take much to recognize it." Abigail didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever named it so plainly before, so without pity, like it was simply a fact he'd observed and set aside, rather than a wound he intended to press on. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand steady under her elbow, and then he climbed up beside her and took the reins, and for a long while neither of them spoke as the wagon rolled out of Amber Creek and up into the folding shadows of the foothills. "I ought to tell you plain," Caleb said, finally, eyes on the road. "Since I reckon nobody else has bothered. I didn't ask for a beauty, Miss Whitmore, on account of I don't much trust beauty. Trusted it once, and it cost me more than I care to talk about. What I asked for was somebody who'd work honest and treat this place and the folks on it with some respect. That's all I asked for. And near as I can tell from that letter your brother sent, that's exactly what I'm getting." Abigail's hands tightened in her lap. "My brother's letter say anything else?" Caleb was quiet a moment. "Said you weren't much to look at. Said I shouldn't expect a wife who'd turn heads." His jaw tightened just slightly, the only sign of anything working beneath the calm surface. "I'll be honest with you, ma'am. I didn't care for the way it was written. Man oughtn't talk about his own sister that way, not to a stranger, not to anybody. Struck me as a poor excuse for a brother." "He's not wrong, though," Abigail said quietly, looking down at her hands. "About how I look." "That's so." Caleb's voice was mild, but there was something underneath it, something that made Abigail glance over at him despite herself. "Well, I've been up in these mountains a long while, Miss Whitmore, mostly by my own choosing, and I've had time to notice folks tend to see exactly what they've been told to see, and nothing more. Your brother told me not to expect much. I expect he told you the same thing probably more times than either of us could count." He flicked the reins gently. "I don't put much stock in what a man says about someone when he's trying to be rid of her. Seems to me that's the last person whose opinion's worth trusting." Abigail felt her eyes sting and she turned her face toward the passing hills so he wouldn't see it. "You don't know me," she said again, but softer this time, less like a warning and more like an admission. "No," Caleb agreed. "But I aim to, if that suits you." She didn't answer right away. The wagon climbed higher, the air growing thinner and cooler despite the summer sun, and somewhere in the silence, Abigail found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember, not bracing for the next cruelty. It felt strange. It felt almost dangerous, like trusting a floor she wasn't sure would hold her weight. "It suits me," she said finally. Caleb nodded once, like that settled something important, and said nothing more about it. They reached the ranch as the light was beginning to slant long and gold across the grass. A solid log house, a barn corrals, holding a dozen or so horses. All of it set into a wide shelf of land, with the mountains rising up close and steep behind it. A ranch hand was working near the barn. A wiry man in his middle years who straightened up as the wagon approached and squinted at Abigail with open, unhurried curiosity. "This the new Mrs. Boss?" the man called out. "This is Miss Whitmore," Caleb said, an edge of correction in his tone. "She'll be joining the household. Miss Whitmore, this is Otis. Been with me going on 6 years now. Good man, talks too much." "Somebody's got to," Otis said cheerfully, tipping his hat to Abigail. "Pleasure, ma'am. You'll find the boss don't say 6 words. If 2 will do so, I try and make up the difference." Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the grief still sitting heavy in her chest, Abigail felt the corner of her mouth twitch toward a smile. "I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Otis." "Just Otis, ma'am. Ain't been a Mr. anything since my daddy passed." Caleb helped her down from the wagon, and this time when his hand closed around hers, Abigail found she didn't flinch away from it. "House is through here," Caleb said, nodding toward the porch. "I'll warn you it's been a bachelor's house a long while. Ain't much to look at inside. I'll leave it to you to make of it what you will if that suits." "It suits," Abigail said again, and meant it more than she had the first time. The inside of the house was plain but solid. A big front room with a stone hearth, a kitchen with a heavy table, a narrow staircase leading to rooms above. It had the particular bareness of a place kept by a man alone. Everything functional. Nothing soft, no curtains, no flowers in a jar, no sign that anyone had ever tried to make it feel like more than a place to sleep between long days of work. Abigail stood in the middle of the front room and felt unexpectedly a stir of something that wasn't fear at all, possibility. "There's a room upstairs end of the hall," Caleb said. "It's yours. I'll not be troubling you there unless you say otherwise, and I don't expect to say otherwise any time soon. We hardly know each other, Miss Whitmore. I don't aim to rush a thing that oughtn't be rushed." Abigail turned to look at him fully for the first time since they'd arrived, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. "Thank you," she said. "For that." "No need for thanks. It's only decent." He set her suitcase down at the bottom of the stairs. "There's stew on the stove Otis's wife brought over before she headed back to town. She does that when she hears I've got company coming on account of she don't trust my cooking any more than I trust it myself. You're welcome to eat first if you're hungry, or rest, whichever you'd rather." "I'd like to eat," Abigail admitted. "It's been a long few days." "Reckon it has." He hesitated at the kitchen doorway, hat still in his hands, and for a moment something more uncertain moved across his face. Something almost boyish, despite the weathered lines of him. "I know this ain't the situation either of us would have chosen for ourselves given the world worked different. I know that. But I mean to treat you fair, Miss Whitmore. Whatever else comes of this, I mean to treat you fair. That's a promise, and I don't make those loosely." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. This quiet, careful, mountain-worn man who had looked at her without flinching, who had spoken of her worth like it was a fact and not a favor, and she felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in 15 years. Not since before the barn dance. Before Llewellyn Briggs' laughter had taught her to expect the worst from every room she walked into. "I believe you," she said, and for the first time since the stage had pulled away from her brother's house, Abigail Whitmore did not feel like a joke or a burden or a woman being handed off because no one else wanted the trouble of her. She felt, however faintly, however cautiously, like she might have finally arrived somewhere that could in time become a home. Supper was quiet at first, the particular quiet of 2 strangers learning the shape of each other's silences. But by the time Abigail set down her spoon, Caleb had asked her 3 questions about herself: where she'd learned to cook, whether she preferred horses or cattle work, what she thought of the mountains so far, and each one had been asked plainly with real interest, the way a person asks when they actually want the answer, and not simply to fill the silence before returning to their own concerns. "You ask a lot of questions for a man Otis says don't say 6 words if 2 will do," Abigail observed. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of Caleb's mouth. "Otis exaggerates. Man's paid to talk, not to tell the truth." He set down his own spoon. Truth is, Miss Whitmore, I've lived alone on this mountain a good long while longer than's probably good for a man. Gets so a person forgets how to make conversation. But I find I don't mind trying with you. Why's that? He considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything, turning it over before he answered. Because you listen like you're actually hearing what's said, he told her. Most folks, they're just waiting for their turn to talk. You ain't done that once tonight. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to being observed so closely, so kindly. Maybe I just don't have much to say yet. Maybe? Caleb allowed. Or maybe you're used to folks not much caring to hear it. Either way, I aim to keep asking. Man's got to start somewhere if he means to actually know the woman he's married. The word married sat between them for a moment, solid and strange, and Abigail felt her pulse quicken, not with fear this time, but with something she didn't have a name for yet, something cautiously, dangerously close to hope. She was still sitting with that feeling when the kitchen door banged open and a second ranch hand came in without knocking, a younger man with a sharp, unfriendly face that Abigail hadn't seen before. "Boss, that mare's gone and—" The man stopped short, eyes landing on Abigail, and something in his expression curdled into open scorn. This the one Whitmore sent up Lord above. Guess a man takes what he can get when he's this far up a mountain. The kitchen went very still. Caleb rose from his chair, unhurried but absolute, the way a man rises when there is no question at all about what happens next. "Dutch," he said, and his voice had dropped into something low and cold that Abigail hadn't heard from him yet. "You'll apologize to Miss Whitmore. Now." Dutch's grin faltered just slightly, but pride made him reckless. "Come on, boss, I was only saying what half the county's already." "I don't much care what half the county's saying," Caleb cut in, and the words landed like a closing door. "I care what's said in my house under my roof to a woman under my protection. You'll apologize, or you'll collect your pay tonight and find work someplace that suits your manners better. Your choice, and I ain't asking twice." The silence stretched long enough that Abigail could hear her own heartbeat. Dutch's jaw worked, humiliation and defiance warring plainly across his face, and for a moment it seemed he might actually choose the door rather than bend. Then his shoulders dropped just slightly. "My apologies, ma'am," he muttered, not looking at her. "Didn't mean nothing by it." "You meant every word of it," Caleb said flatly. "But I'll let it lie this once. See to that mare. We'll talk in the morning about whether there's still a place for you here." Dutch left without another word, the door swinging shut hard behind him, and the kitchen settled back into stillness. Abigail sat very still, her hands folded tight in her lap, unused to anyone standing between her and a cruelty aimed her way. In her brother's house, she had learned to absorb such moments alone, silently, because no one had ever thought her worth defending. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Caleb said, sitting back down, though the tension hadn't fully left his shoulders. "That ain't how things are run here, not how I intend to run them, and not how they'll be run going forward." "You didn't have to do that," Abigail said quietly. "Yes," Caleb said simply, like there was no other possible answer. "I did." Abigail looked at him for a long moment, and something inside her, some old and calcified certainty about her own worth, cracked just slightly at the edges. "Nobody's ever done that for me before," she admitted, and hated how small her voice sounded, how much it revealed. Caleb's expression didn't change to pity, which she was grateful for. Pity was its own kind of cruelty, dressed up gentler. Instead, something steadier moved across his face, something that looked almost like quiet anger on her behalf. "Then the folks in your life before now didn't know what they had," he said. "That ain't a reflection on you, Miss Whitmore. That's a reflection on them." Abigail didn't trust herself to answer that. She looked down at her hands instead, at her mother's ring still on her finger, and let the silence hold for a moment before she found her voice again. "Thank you," she said. "For supper. For all of it." "You're welcome here," Caleb said. "That ain't a small thing to say, and I don't say it loosely. You're welcome here, Miss Whitmore. Whatever else this arrangement turns out to be, that much I mean." Later, alone in the narrow room at the end of the hall, Abigail sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't her mother's in a house that wasn't yet a home in a territory she hadn't chosen, and she found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember, not crying from grief. She sat instead with her mother's hairpin box in her lap, running her thumb over the worn carving, and let herself feel cautiously like testing weight on new ice, something that might in time grow into belonging. Outside, she could hear the low murmur of Caleb's voice on the porch, talking quietly with Otis about the morning's work, steady and unhurried. A man settling his household for the night. The way he seemed to do everything with care, without apology, without needing anyone's permission to be decent. Abigail Whitmore, who had been told her whole life that she was too much and not enough all at once, closed her eyes and let herself, just for tonight, believe that maybe her family had been wrong. Maybe she wasn't the joke they'd made her out to be. Maybe 300 miles from everyone who had ever called her worthless, she had finally found the one place and the one man willing to see her plain. Abigail woke before dawn out of habit, the old habit of a woman who had learned that lying too long in bed only invited someone else's complaints. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The light through the window was wrong. Gray and cold and mountain thin instead of the flat gold she'd known her whole life. And then she remembered, and something in her chest turned over slow and strange. She was not in her brother's house. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair the way her mother had taught her, and went down to the kitchen, expecting to find it empty. Instead, she found Caleb already at the table, a cup of black coffee in front of him, boots on, clearly a man who had been awake for some time. "Didn't expect you up this early," he said, glancing at her. "Figured the journey would have wore you out for another hour or two." "I don't sleep late," Abigail said. "Never have. Good habit for a ranch." He nodded toward the stove. "There's coffee if you want it. Ain't much else. I generally just eat whatever's easiest before I head out." Abigail looked at the stove, at the bare shelves beside it, at the general bachelor bareness of a kitchen that had clearly never had a woman's hand in it for longer than a passing visit, and felt something settle into purpose inside her. "Give me a week," she said, "and this kitchen won't recognize itself." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of something warmer. "That's so. That's so." She was already moving toward the shelves, taking stock, the old habit of managing a household rising up in her like muscle memory. "You have flour. Some. Lard. Some of that too, I reckon. Eggs. Chickens are out back. Help yourself." Abigail turned to look at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt something like her own footing under her. "Mr. Thornton, by the end of the week you're going to wonder how you survived this long eating whatever was easiest." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close enough that Abigail felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. "I look forward to it, Miss Whitmore." He left for the corrals not long after, and Abigail spent the morning taking the kitchen apart and putting it back together the way she wanted it, scrubbing the stove, sorting the shelves, finding places for things that had clearly never had a proper place at all. By midday, she had bread rising and a pot of beans simmering with salt pork, and when Otis wandered in around noon, looking for something to eat, he stopped dead in the doorway and stared like he'd walked into the wrong house. "Lord have mercy," he said. "It smells like something in here. It's called Cooking Otis. Boss has been eating burnt bacon and hardtack going on 3 years. I plumb forgot a kitchen could smell like this." He peered at the bread cooling on the counter with open longing. "Any chance a man could—" "After supper," Abigail said, swatting his hand away without looking up. "Same as everybody else." Otis laughed, delighted, and ambled back out toward the barn, and Abigail found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember without immediately checking to see who was watching her, waiting to be corrected, waiting for someone to remind her that smiling too easily wasn't becoming of a woman who looked like her. Nobody was watching. Nobody needed to correct her. It was a strange, unsteady kind of freedom. Supper that evening was better than the night before, not because either of them had relaxed entirely, but because the silences between them had started to feel less like empty space and more like room to breathe. Caleb ate 2 full helpings without saying much, which Abigail was coming to understand was from him close to a rapturous review. "Bread's good," he said finally when his plate was clean. Real good. High praise. I don't hand it out easy. He looked at her, something considering in his gaze. You didn't learn to cook like that from nothing, Miss Whitmore. That's a skill somebody worked at. My mother, Abigail said. She died when I was 15. Taught me everything she knew before that, though cooking, canning, doctoring with what grows wild. Said a woman ought to know how to take care of herself and everyone around her on account of you never know who's going to need taking care of or when. Sounds like she was a wise woman. She was the only one in that house who ever thought I was worth teaching anything. Abigail hadn't meant to say it so plainly, and she felt her face heat as soon as it left her mouth. I'm sorry. You didn't ask for all that. I did ask, actually, Caleb said. Asked what your mother taught you. You just answered honest, which I'd rather have than polite any day of the week. He leaned back in his chair, studying her in that unhurried way of his. Your brothers give you trouble your whole life? Or was it something particular set it off? Abigail hesitated. It wasn't a story she'd told anyone. Not really, not the whole of it. But something about Caleb's stillness, the way he waited without pushing, made the words come easier than she expected. There was a dance, she said. Barn dance when I was 12. I wore my mother's dress taken in to fit me, and I thought I looked pretty enough. There was a girl there, Llewellyn Briggs, and she said something about me in front of the boys. Called me a name I won't repeat. Everybody laughed. Even folks I thought were my friends. She looked down at her hands. After that, it was like everybody in the county decided that was who I was. The joke. The one you laughed at, so you wouldn't be laughed at yourself. My own family started saying it too, eventually. Easier to join in than defend me, I suppose. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when Abigail finally looked up at him, his jaw was tight in a way that made her think unexpectedly of the way he'd stood up to Dutch the night before. That Llewellyn Briggs still living in your hometown? He asked. Last I knew. Why? No reason, Caleb said, though something in his tone suggested there was in fact a reason, and it wasn't a kind one. Just filing away information. Man likes to know who he's dealing with, even from 300 miles off. Abigail almost laughed the idea of Caleb Thornton nursing a grudge against a girl he'd never met on her behalf over an insult 15 years old. Struck her as both absurd and somewhere underneath the absurdity deeply quietly moving. You don't have to defend me against people you've never met, she said. I don't have to do a lot of things I do anyway, Caleb said simply. Doesn't mean I won't. They sat with that for a moment, the fire popping in the hearth, and Abigail found herself studying him, the way she hadn't quite let herself. The day before, the set of his shoulders, the quiet watchfulness in his eyes, the way he held himself like a man who'd spent a long time being careful with his own strength. Can I ask you something? She said. Ask. Otis said this was a bachelor's house going on a long while. Why, a man like you, a spread like this, I'd have thought half the county would have been lined up trying to marry into it. Something shuddered behind Caleb's eyes, quick and total, like a door closing. That's a longer conversation, he said, and not one I'm ready to have tonight. Abigail felt the sting of the refusal old instinct rearing up to tell her. She'd overstepped, asked for too much, been too much. But Caleb's face wasn't cold exactly. It was closer to pained, closer to a man standing at the edge of something he wasn't ready to walk into yet. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to pry. You didn't pry, Caleb said. It's a fair question. I just ain't got a fair answer for it yet. Give me time, Miss Whitmore. I'll tell you, just not tonight. Take all the time you need, Abigail said, and meant it. He looked at her for a long moment, something grateful and raw moving across his face, and then he nodded once, and rose from the table, and the conversation closed as gently as it had opened. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Abigail hadn't expected to find so quickly, or to want so badly once she'd found it. She rose before dawn, worked the kitchen and the garden, tended the chickens, mended what needed mending, and slowly, methodically began to turn Caleb Thornton's bachelor house into something that looked and felt and smelled like a home. Dutch remained a shadow at the edges of it all, polite enough after Caleb's warning, but never warm, watching Abigail with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between resentment and calculation that made her uneasy in a way she couldn't put words to. "Don't mind Dutch," Otis told her one afternoon, catching her watching the younger man ride out toward the north pasture. "Boy's got a chip on his shoulder the size of the mountain. Always has. Boss keeps him on 'cause he's good with horses, and 'cause his mother asked Caleb personal to give him work after his daddy ran off. But he ain't never liked answering to nobody, and he sure as anything don't like a woman coming in and changing how things run." "I'm not trying to change how things run. I know that. You know that. Dutch don't much care what's true when there's a grudge to nurse." Otis shrugged, easy and unbothered. "Don't fret over him, Miss Whitmore. Boss keeps a close eye. Always has." Abigail nodded, but the unease didn't entirely leave her, settling instead into a low hum at the back of her thoughts, the kind of feeling she'd learned as a girl not to entirely ignore. It was 3 days later that she got her first real glimpse of what Caleb Thornton looked like when something mattered enough to strip the careful stillness away from him. She'd walked out to the barn in the late afternoon to bring water to the horses, and found Caleb standing over a young mare that had gone lame in the front leg, his hands moving over the joint with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the size of him, his face drawn tight with worry. "Is she going to be all right?" Abigail asked. Caleb didn't look up right away, too absorbed in the examination. "Strained something. Might be worse. Can't tell for certain till the swelling goes down." He glanced at her then, and something in his expression eased slightly at the sight of her. "This is Dolly. She was my mother's horse years back. About the only thing of my mother's I've still got. Getting on in years now, but she's a good animal. Doesn't deserve to be put down over a strained leg." "Nobody's talking about putting her down." "Not yet," Caleb said, and there was something underneath the words, some old fear he wasn't naming outright. "But out here, an animal that can't work is an animal that's a mouth to feed for nothing. Some ranchers wouldn't think twice." "You're not some ranchers." Caleb looked up at her, something searching in his gaze. "No," he agreed slowly. "I ain't." He returned his attention to the mare's leg, running his hand along the swelling with careful precision. "I'll wrap it tonight, keep her off it a week, see how she does. She's tougher than she looks. Reminds me of somebody else I know." Abigail felt her breath catch slightly at the quiet weight of the comparison, and she busied herself with the water bucket to keep from having to answer. That night after supper, she found herself unable to settle, thinking of the mare in the barn, of the careful worry on Caleb's face, and she slipped out to check on the animal herself before bed. She found Caleb already there, sitting on an overturned crate beside the stall, a lantern casting warm light over both of them, his hand resting on the mare's neck. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without turning. "Wanted to see how she was doing. Resting easier now. Swelling's gone down some." He glanced at Abigail, and in the lantern light, his face looked younger, less guarded, the day's careful composure worn thin by worry and exhaustion. "You don't have to lose sleep over my horse, Miss Whitmore." "Somebody ought to worry over the things you worry over," Abigail said, settling onto a second crate a few feet away. "Seems only fair, given you're always worrying over things that concern me." Caleb was quiet a long moment, watching the mare's slow, steady breathing. "I told you I'd tell you," he said finally, "about why the house sat empty so long." Abigail went very still, not wanting to break whatever fragile thing had opened up the door to this. "Her name was Rachel," Caleb said, eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. "We were to be married 5 years back. Grew up together near enough her family had the spread 2 valleys over. Everybody figured we'd end up wed since we were children, and I never had cause to think different. I loved her the way you love something you've never had to question." His hand tightened slightly on the mare's neck. "There was fever that came through the territory that winter. Took a lot of folks. Took her in 11 days. I sat with her near every one of them, and there wasn't a thing I could do but watch." "Caleb," Abigail said softly, "I'm so sorry. After that I didn't much see the point in trying again." He continued, like he needed to get all of it out now that he'd started. "Buried myself in the work instead. Told myself the ranch was enough. Told myself a long while, actually, and mostly believed it until your brother's letter came through Preacher Coleman, and something in me thought maybe it's time to stop being alone, just 'cause it's safer than the alternative." He finally looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "I didn't ask for a wife because I'd forgotten Rachel Miss Whitmore. I asked because 5 years of being alone taught me being safe from losing somebody ain't the same thing as being happy, and I got tired of confusing the two." Abigail didn't trust her voice for a moment, moved by the confession more than she knew how to say. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for telling me." "Figured you deserved to know," Caleb said, "seeing as you've thrown your own lot in with mine, whether either of us fully chose it outright. Didn't seem fair to keep you guessing at what ghosts you might be living alongside." "I don't mind ghosts," Abigail said. "Everybody's got a few. I've got mine too, just wear mine on my face instead of keeping them buried in a valley 2 rides over." Something in Caleb's expression shifted, at that softened, deepened, moved towards something Abigail didn't quite have the courage to name yet. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. "I think whoever taught you to believe your face was something to apologize for was looking at the wrong thing entirely." Abigail's breath caught. The lantern light flickered between them, warm and low, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence charged with something new and fragile and entirely unfamiliar to both of them. "It's getting late," Abigail said finally, breaking the moment before she did something reckless like believe him entirely. "Reckon it is." Caleb agreed, though he didn't move right away, and neither did she. The trouble started, as trouble often does on an ordinary Tuesday, with a trip into Amber Creek for supplies that Abigail had been dreading since Caleb first mentioned it. "You don't have to come," he told her that morning, reading something in her hesitation. "I can manage the list myself." "No," Abigail said, straightening her spine the way her mother used to when facing down something unpleasant. "I need to go sometime. Might as well be today with you beside me." The town was small, tidy, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves, and Abigail felt the weight of curious eyes on her the moment the wagon rolled onto the main street. Word had clearly traveled. The mountain rancher had finally taken a wife sight unseen from some family out east, and the townsfolk were not shy about their staring. "Don't mind them," Caleb murmured, helping her down from the wagon. "Easy for you to say." They made it as far as the mercantile before the first real trouble found them. A woman emerged from the general store just as they approached, well-dressed, sharp-featured, clearly someone of standing in the small community, and stopped dead at the sight of Abigail, her expression curdling into something between shock and poorly disguised amusement. "Caleb Thornton," the woman said. "So the rumors were true. Mrs. Ashford?" Caleb said, his voice going carefully neutral. "This is Miss Whitmore, my wife, soon as the preacher's free to make it official." Mrs. Ashford's eyes traveled over Abigail with an appraisal so blatant it made Abigail's skin crawl, the same old assessment she'd endured her entire life, the silent verdict rendered before a single word was exchanged. "Well," Mrs. Ashford said, finally, a thin smile fixed on her face. "I suppose a man alone up in those mountains can't afford to be too particular. Practicality over beauty, very sensible, I'm sure." The words landed exactly as they were meant to, a blade wrapped in polite conversation, and Abigail felt the old familiar heat of shame rise up her neck, felt herself start to shrink the way she always had, the way 15 years of practice had trained her to. Then Caleb spoke, and his voice cut through the street like a dropped stone through still water. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "I'll thank you not to speak of my wife that way in my hearing or otherwise. Miss Whitmore's worth ain't up for your discussion, and frankly I'd think a woman of your standing would know better than to comment on a stranger's looks in the middle of a public street. Ain't exactly Christian behavior, is it?" The color drained from Mrs. Ashford's face, humiliation flashing behind her eyes. "I meant no offense, Mr. Thornton. You meant exactly the offense you gave," Caleb said, unmoved. "I've known you a long while, Mrs. Ashford, and I've never once known you to say a careless word. Good day." He took Abigail's arm, and steered her past the stunned woman and into the mercantile. And it wasn't until they were inside alone in the aisle between flour sacks and coffee tins that Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Not in front of the whole street." "Yes," Caleb said again, the same simple certainty as before. "I did." He looked at her, something fierce and protective in his expression that made Abigail's heart stutter. "Folks in this town are going to have to learn quick that anybody who speaks to you that way speaks to me that way too. Sooner they learn it, sooner they'll stop trying." Abigail felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "Nobody's ever stood up for me like that. Not once. Not my whole life. Then it's past time somebody started," Caleb said, gruff, now uncomfortable with the emotion in her voice, but not looking away from her either. "Come on. Let's get this list filled and get home before the whole town finds a reason to test my patience twice in one afternoon." They finished their errands with less trouble than Abigail expected. Word of the exchange with Mrs. Ashford seemed to have traveled fast enough to discourage further comment, though she caught more than a few curious calculating glances following them down the street. It was on their way back to the wagon that Abigail noticed a man watching them from the porch of the saloon, older weathered, dressed sharper than most of the ranchers and farmers milling through town. A look on his face that wasn't curiosity at all, but something closer to recognition. "Caleb," she said quietly. "Who is that man?" Caleb followed her gaze, and something tightened almost imperceptibly in his jaw. "Name's Wendell Cross. Land agent, works for the territorial office, or claims to anyway. Been sniffing around ranches in this valley the better part of a year trying to convince folks to sell off water rights or take out loans against their land for improvements they don't need. Slippery sort. I don't do business with him, and I don't intend to start. He's staring at us. He stares at everybody. Man's always calculating something." Caleb helped her up into the wagon, his movements slightly more clipped than before. "Don't concern yourself with Wendell Cross, Miss Whitmore. He's a nuisance, not a danger, at least not yet." Abigail glanced back once more as the wagon pulled away, and found Wendell Cross still watching them, an unreadable expression on his face, and something about the stillness of his gaze settled uneasily in her chest. A small, cold seed of worry she couldn't quite explain, and couldn't quite shake either. The storm rolled in 3 nights later, sudden and violent, the way summer storms in the mountains often were, the sky splitting open with a fury that rattled the windows and sent the horses screaming in the corral. Abigail woke to the sound of it, to Caleb's boots pounding down the stairs and out the door, and she was dressed and following him before she'd fully thought through what she was doing. "Stay inside," Caleb shouted over the wind already halfway to the barn. "It's too dangerous." "Dolly's still favoring that leg," Abigail shouted back. "If she panics in that stall, she could hurt herself worse." She didn't wait for his answer, running through the rain toward the barn, her nightdress plastered to her legs, lightning splitting the sky in jagged white cracks overhead. Inside, the horses were in a frenzy, screaming and kicking at their stalls, and Dolly, the injured mare, was rearing against the door of her stall in a panic that could easily re-injure the leg Caleb had spent days nursing. "Easy," Abigail said, forcing calm into her voice, despite the thundering chaos around her, easing the stall door open just enough to slip inside. "Easy now, girl. I know it's frightening." The mare's eyes were wild, white-rimmed with terror, and she reared again, hooves striking dangerously close to Abigail's head. Abigail didn't retreat. She kept her voice low and steady, kept her hands moving in slow, deliberate motions, the way her mother had taught her with the wildest of their own animals years ago. "I've got you," she murmured. "I've got you. I promise, just breathe now. Just breathe." Caleb burst into the barn a moment later, drenched panic flashing across his face at the sight of her inside the stall with a terrified 1,000-pound animal. "Abigail, get out of there." "She's calming down," Abigail said, not taking her eyes off the mare, her hand now resting flat against Dolly's trembling neck. "Give me a second." "That's not a request, that's an order." "Since when do you give me orders, Caleb Thornton?" The absurdity of arguing in the middle of a thunderstorm, inches from a panicked horse, seemed to strike them both at once, And despite everything, Abigail felt something like a laugh bubble up in her chest, even as the storm raged outside. Dolly's trembling slowly eased under Abigail's steady hand, her wild eyes calming her weight, settling more evenly onto all four legs, instead of favoring the injured one in her panic. By the time the worst of the thunder had rolled past, the mare stood quiet and shivering, but steady, and Abigail let out a long breath and finally stepped back from the stall. Caleb was staring at her like he'd never seen her before. "How'd you do that?" he asked. "My mother," Abigail said simply. "Told you. She taught me most everything I know." It was only then, in the sudden quiet after the storm's fury, that Abigail realized how soaked she was, how badly she was shivering, the adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis finally draining away and leaving cold and exhaustion in its place. Caleb seemed to notice at the same moment his expression shifting from awe to alarm. "You're freezing," he said. "Come on. Inside. Now." He didn't wait for her agreement this time, wrapping his own coat around her shoulders and steering her firmly toward the house, and Abigail was too tired and too cold to argue. Inside, he built up the fire with quick, efficient movements and pressed a blanket into her hands, and knelt in front of her chair to check her hands and feet for signs of true cold, his touch gentle despite the urgency in his movements. "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said, though the anger in his voice had gone soft, worried instead of scolding. "That mare could have killed you panicked like that." "She didn't, though." Abigail. Her name in his mouth, unadorned by any title, stopped her breath entirely. It was the first time he'd said it. "You could have been hurt bad. I couldn't have—" He stopped, jaw working, something raw moving behind his eyes. "I couldn't have lived with that." "I'm all right," she said softly. "Caleb, I'm all right." He looked up at her, then still kneeling in front of her chair, firelight flickering warm across his face, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The air between them charged with something neither of them seemed ready to name. "You're the bravest person I believe I've ever met," Caleb said, finally quiet and rough. "And I've known some brave people in my time." "I'm not brave," Abigail said. "I was just scared of losing something before I'd even had the chance to see it saved." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, understanding passing between them that went deeper than words, and he reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed a strand of wet hair back from her face. "Nobody's ever fought it for anything of mine like that," he said. "Not since—" He stopped himself, but Abigail understood the rest of the sentence without him finishing it. "I wasn't fighting for something of yours," Abigail said quietly. "I was fighting for something I've come to care about too." The words hung between them, honest and unguarded, in a way neither of them had quite managed before, and for a moment, Abigail thought he might close the distance between them entirely. But Caleb, careful as always, drew back instead, though something had shifted permanently in the space between them, something that couldn't be unfelt now that it had been named. "Get some rest," he said, voice rough. "We'll talk more in the morning." Abigail nodded and let him help her up the stairs, and lay awake a long while after replaying the sound of her own name in his mouth, the warmth of his hand against her face, the terrible, wonderful realization that she was no longer simply surviving this arrangement. She was beginning cautiously, dangerously, to want it. Otis noticed the change between them before either of them fully admitted it to themselves. He took to whistling around the ranch house with a knowing look that made Abigail blush and Caleb scowl without any real heat behind it. And one morning over coffee, he set down his cup with theatrical significance. "Been meaning to ask, boss," he said. "When's the wedding exactly? Only I'd like some warning if I'm to get my good shirt cleaned proper." "Otis, just asking on account of the whole valley's asking, seeing as how you defended Miss Whitmore's honor clean across Main Street last week. Folks talk boss. Especially when a man who's kept to himself 5 years suddenly starts hollering at Beatrice Ashford in public." Caleb's ears went faintly red, which Abigail found more endearing than she cared to admit. "The wedding'll happen when it happens. Preacher Coleman's got circuit duties clear across 3 counties. He'll be through in a few weeks' time. Until then, it ain't anybody's business but ours." "Wasn't prying," Otis said, entirely unrepentant. "Just planning my shirt." Abigail hid her smile behind her coffee cup and caught Caleb glancing at her with something warm and private in his eyes, a look that had nothing to do with obligation, and everything to do with something neither of them had put a name to yet, but both of them were starting cautiously to feel. It was that same afternoon that trouble found them again, this time in a form neither of them had anticipated. Abigail was hanging washing behind the house when she heard raised voices from the direction of the barn, and she rounded the corner to find Dutch and Caleb standing close, both men rigid with tension, Otis hovering nearby with the careful stillness of a man deciding whether to intervene. "Ain't none of your business what I do on my own time," Dutch was saying. "It's my business when you're spreading talk in town that reflects on this ranch," Caleb said low and hard. "Wendell Cross said you'd been in the saloon 3 nights running drinking on credit you don't have, talking about how this outfit's headed for trouble now that I've got a wife to keep instead of just cattle. That true?" Dutch's face went tight and defensive. "Man's got a right to a drink. Man's got a right to a drink he can pay for," Caleb corrected. "Not one he's putting on my name without asking, and not while running his mouth about my household to a land agent who's been circling this valley for a year, looking for exactly the kind of weakness a loose-lipped ranch hand might hand him for free." Something in Dutch's expression flickered guilt maybe, or something closer to fear before it hardened back into defiance. "I don't answer to you for what I say over a drink," he said. "You do while you're drawing wages from this ranch," Caleb said. "This is your last warning, Dutch. Next time I hear you've been talking ranch business to Wendell Cross or anybody else in that saloon, you're finished here. Am I understood?" Dutch's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Abigail thought he might argue further. Instead, he turned on his heel and stalked off toward the bunkhouse without another word, and Caleb watched him go with an expression of tired frustration. "Everything all right?" Abigail asked, stepping closer. Caleb ran a hand over his face. "Dutch has been talking to Wendell Cross. Don't know exactly what he said, but knowing Dutch's temper, I doubt it's been complimentary." He looked at Abigail, worry plain in his eyes. "I don't like it. Cross doesn't sniff around a ranch without reason, and he doesn't waste time cultivating loose-lipped ranch hands unless he's building towards something. What could he want with this ranch? Don't know yet," Caleb admitted. "But I intend to find out before he decides to show his hand." Abigail felt the cold seed of worry from their trip into town bloom slightly larger in her chest, but she pushed it down, unwilling to let it overshadow the fragile, precious thing that had begun growing between herself and Caleb over these past weeks. "Whatever it is," she said, "we'll face it together." Caleb looked at her, something grateful and searching in his gaze, and reached out to take her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. "Together," he agreed, quiet and certain, like a vow he intended to keep. The days that followed carried a new tension beneath their surface, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before, but they carried tenderness too, growing steadily between Abigail and Caleb in small, unremarkable moments. A shared laugh over a burnt pie, an evening spent teaching Abigail to read brand marks on distant cattle, a quiet walk to the ridge behind the house where Caleb showed her the spot where he meant someday to build a proper garden fence to keep the deer out. "You're already planning gardens with me," Abigail said, standing beside him on the ridge. The whole valley spread gold and green below them in the long evening light. "Bold of you, Mr. Thornton, given we're not yet wed." "I'm a practical man," Caleb said, though the look he gave her was anything but practical, warm and unguarded in a way that made Abigail's pulse quicken. "Man plans for the things he intends to keep. And you intend to keep me? I intend to try," Caleb said, quiet and honest. "If you'll let me." Abigail felt her breath catch the weight of the question settling somewhere deep and warm inside her chest. 15 years of being told she was unwanted, and here was a man on a mountain ridge asking plainly, sincerely, if he might be allowed to want her instead. "I'll let you," she said softly. Caleb reached up slow and careful, giving her every chance to step back, and cupped her face in his weathered hand. "Abigail Whitmore," he said, "I don't know what your family saw when they looked at you, and I don't much care to understand it, on account of it clearly wasn't the truth of you at all. What I see is a woman who calmed a panicked horse in the middle of a thunderstorm without a second thought for her own safety. A woman who took a bachelor's neglected house and turned it into something that smells like home for the first time in 5 years. A woman brave enough to stand in a strange town and hold her head up despite every cruel word thrown her way." His thumb traced gently along her cheekbone. "I see somebody I mean to spend the rest of my life being grateful for, if you'll have me." Tears slipped down Abigail's cheeks before she could stop them, and Caleb caught one with the pad of his thumb, gentle as anything. "I'll have you," she whispered. "Caleb Thornton, I'll have you." He leaned down slowly, and when his lips met hers, it was gentle. Careful. A question answered rather than a demand made, and Abigail felt something inside her that had been broken and small and hidden for 15 years finally quietly begin to heal. They stood together on the ridge a long while after the sun sinking behind the mountains, the valley below them settling into the soft blue hush of evening. Two people who had each, in their own separate griefs, given up on the idea of being truly seen, and had found it anyway, against every expectation in each other. It was on their walk back down toward the house, hands still linked, contentment settling warm and unfamiliar in Abigail's chest, that they saw the rider approaching from the direction of the main road, moving fast, dust kicking up behind the horse's hooves in the fading light. Caleb's grip on Abigail's hand tightened his easy contentment, shifting instantly into wary alertness. "That's not one of ours," he said quietly. The rider drew closer, and as the shape resolved into a familiar silhouette, Abigail felt her stomach drop, felt every fragile, hard-won piece of the last few weeks go suddenly cold and uncertain. She knew that horse. She knew that riding posture upright and self-important even at a gallop. "Caleb," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that's my brother's horse." Silas Whitmore swung down from his horse before it had even fully stopped, boots hitting the dirt hard, and Abigail felt every muscle in her body go rigid at the sight of him standing on Caleb's land, like he had every right in the world to be there. "Well," Silas said, dusting off his coat eyes, moving from Abigail to Caleb, and back again, lingering a moment too long on their joined hands before his mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ain't this a picture? Didn't take you long to get comfortable, did it, Abby?" "Silas." Abigail's voice came out steadier than she felt. "What are you doing here? Come to see my sister. Is that a crime now?" Silas's eyes cut to Caleb, sizing him up the way he'd size up a horse he was thinking of buying cheap and selling dear. "You'd be Thornton, I take it. Funny. Preacher Coleman's cousin described you different. Said you were a hard man to read. Standing here holding my sister's hand like a schoolboy don't seem all that hard to read to me." "Mr. Whitmore," Caleb said. And Abigail felt him shift his weight slightly, angling himself a half step in front of her, without making it look like a deliberate thing. "You've ridden a long way. I'd offer you supper before we talk business, but something tells me you didn't come 300 miles for my hospitality." "Smart man." Silas's gaze hardened. "No, I didn't." "Then say what you came to say." Silas looked at Abigail again, and for a moment something almost like performance crossed his face, an expression she recognized from childhood. The look he wore right before he told their father a lie, convincing enough to get her blamed for something she hadn't done. "Family's been talking, Abby," he said, "since you left. Cora's had a hard time sleeping thinking about you sent off to some stranger without proper arrangements made. Made me start wondering if we did right by you rushing things the way we did." "You didn't rush anything," Abigail said. "You sold me to the first man who'd take me same as you'd sell off a lame mule you didn't want to feed anymore." "That's an ugly thing to say to your own brother." "It's an ugly thing you did." Abigail shot back and felt something fierce rise up in her chest, something that hadn't dared show itself in 15 years of swallowing exactly this kind of confrontation. "You didn't come 300 miles because Cora couldn't sleep, Silas. You've never once lost sleep over me in your whole life. What do you actually want? For just a moment, something flickered behind Silas's eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the closest thing to it Abigail had ever seen on his face before he covered it with bluster. I want to make sure my sister ain't been taken advantage of, he said louder now, like volume could substitute for conviction. This marriage, it ain't even happened proper yet, has it? No preachers said the words. Way I hear it, you two have just been living up here unmarried, which don't sit right with me, and won't sit right with the church either once word gets round. The preacher's circuit brings him through in a few weeks. Caleb said, voice flat and controlled in a way that told Abigail he was working hard to keep it that way. Same as I told Coleman's cousin when we arranged all this. Nothing improper's happened here, Whitmore, and I'll thank you not to imply otherwise about a woman under my protection. Under your protection? Silas laughed, short and humorless. That's a fine turn of phrase for a man who bought himself a wife sight unseen. Nobody bought anybody, Abigail snapped. Say what you actually came to say, Silas, because I know you and I know this concern of yours is about as real as the last 20 years of concern you've shown me, which is to say, not at all. Something in Silas's composure cracked just slightly, and Abigail watched him glance back toward the road, toward the direction he'd ridden in from, like he was checking to make sure something or someone wasn't following too closely behind. There's a matter, Silas said, finally lower now, involving Pa's old homestead claim. Legal matter. Needs your signature on some papers before it can be settled proper. Abigail went still. What papers? Just formalities, Silas said too quickly. Releasing your claim on the property, seeing as you've gone and set up a new life for yourself elsewhere. Ain't no sense you holding on to a stake in land you'll never live on again. I never knew I had a stake in it at all. Abigail said slowly, watching her brother's face for the tell she knew was there somewhere, the tell she'd learned to read across a childhood of his half-truths. Pa left that homestead to you and Jonah. Everybody always said so. There's a piece that was set aside for you and Ma both way back, Silas said. Legal technicality. Lawyer explained it all. I don't rightly understand the particulars myself, but he said we needed your mark on the papers to clear it up proper, since you're the only living heir on your mother's side of the claim. What lawyer? Silas hesitated just a fraction too long. Fellow out of the territorial office. Works with land matters. Something cold slid down Abigail's spine. Does this lawyer have a name, Silas? Cross, Silas admitted. And the moment the word left his mouth, Abigail watched Caleb's entire body go rigid beside her, all the careful neutrality vanishing from his face in an instant. Wendell Cross, Caleb said very quietly, very dangerously. You know him. Silas asked, some of his earlier bravado faltering at the tone in Caleb's voice. I know of him, Caleb said. Man's been circling this valley near a year trying to buy up water rights from ranchers who don't rightly understand what they're signing away. His eyes fixed on Silas with an intensity that made even Abigail take an involuntary step back. You rode 300 miles to bring your sister papers drawn up by Wendell Cross, and you expect us to believe that's nothing but a family formality. I don't know nothing about water rights, Silas said, and for the first time, his defensiveness sounded less like anger and more like genuine confusion. Cross came to me a month back, said he'd found some old filing from when Pa first staked the homestead claim. Said Ma's maiden name was on part of it on account of some territorial law about widows' portions, and that the claim needed clearing up before it could pass proper to me and Jonah. Said if Abby didn't sign, the whole claim could get tied up in court for years, cost us the land entirely. And he offered to help you avoid all that. Caleb said, for a price I'd wager. Or maybe he offered to buy the disputed piece outright, once Abigail's name was off it. Silas's silence was answer enough. How much, Silas? Abigail said, her voice gone very quiet, very cold. How much is Wendell Cross paying you to bring me these papers? It ain't like that. How much? Silas's jaw worked, and for a moment Abigail thought he might actually lie to her face again, the way he always had. But something in her expression must have finally cut through even his practiced deflection, because his shoulders sagged just slightly, and the truth came out of him like something he'd been carrying too long to hold anymore. $200, he said. Against the debt I owe him already. I borrowed against this spring's cattle sale, and the sale came up short, and Cross was the only one willing to extend credit without asking too many questions. When he found out you were my sister, he came to me himself, said, if I could get your signature on the release, he'd forgive what I owed and pay besides. His voice cracked, something almost like shame bleeding through. I didn't know it had come to all this, Abby. I swear I didn't. I thought it was just paperwork. I didn't know. You didn't know, or you didn't ask, Abigail said. Because you never do, Silas. Never once in your whole life have you asked a hard question when a comfortable answer was sitting right there waiting to be believed instead. The words landed hard, and Silas flinched like he'd been struck. And for the first time in Abigail's memory, her brother had nothing at all to say in his own defense. Caleb stepped forward, his voice low and controlled, but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. This piece of land, Cross, once cleared, where does it sit exactly? Silas hesitated. North boundary mostly, runs along the creek. The creek that feeds this ranch, Caleb said, and it wasn't a question. The creek that feeds half the water in this valley below the fork. I don't know the particulars. I do, Caleb said grimly. Cross has been trying to buy up water access on every ranch in this valley for the better part of a year, one piece at a time, always through some legal technicality nobody quite understands until it's already signed away. If he gets control of the headwaters, he controls every rancher downstream, whether they sell to him outright or not. Man's not building a homestead Whitmore. He's building a stranglehold. Abigail felt the full weight of it settle over her at once. Not just her own signature being sought as some minor formality, but a scheme far larger than her family's petty cruelties. A scheme that could ruin Caleb's ranch, ruin every ranch in the valley built on the backs of desperate men like her brother, who owed debts they couldn't pay, and lawyers slick enough to make robbery look like paperwork. He used you, she said to Silas, and something in her voice had gone from anger toward something closer to pity, though pity for Silas felt like a strange, unfamiliar coat to wear. He used your debt and your desperation, and he sent you to use me, same as everybody's always used me my whole life, as a means to somebody else's end. I'll not sign it, she said, then louder, turning to look between her brother and the empty road behind him, like she half expected Wendell Cross himself to materialize out of the dust. I don't care what claim I have or don't have on Pa's old land. I won't put my name on anything that comes from that man's hand. Abby, if you don't sign, Cross said the whole matter goes to court and lawyers cost money we ain't got. Then let it go to court, Caleb cut in. Let a judge sort out whatever claim exists honest instead of Cross bullying a scared, indebted man into stealing his own sister's rights out from under her. He turned his full attention on Silas, and his voice, when it came, held none of the careful restraint from before. You'll ride back and tell Cross his schemes failed here. And you'll tell him something else, besides. Tell him Caleb Thornton knows exactly what he's been doing in this valley, and Caleb Thornton intends to see every rancher along that creek knows it too before the week's out. Silas looked between them, some last vestige of his earlier bravado crumbling entirely under the weight of what he'd actually done, what he'd actually been party to. He ain't a man you want as an enemy, Silas said quietly. I've seen what happens to folks who cross him. I imagine I have too, Caleb said. Seems to be exactly what he's counting on folks too frightened to stand against him. Well, he picked the wrong valley if he thought fear alone would carry the day. Silas's eyes moved to Abigail one more time, and something almost like an apology moved behind them, though he didn't have the courage even now to say the word outright. I never wanted this for you, Abby, he said instead. Whatever you think of me, I never wanted you hurt. You wanted me gone, Abigail said, steady now, the shaking anger of a few minutes ago settling into something colder and clearer. You wanted me gone so bad. You didn't much care what happened to me after, so long as it happened somewhere far enough away that you didn't have to watch it. That's not the same as never wanting me hurt, Silas. That's just wanting me hurt somewhere you couldn't see it. Silas had no answer for that. He mounted his horse in silence, and for a moment, it seemed he might simply ride away without another word, the whole ugly business left hanging unresolved between them. Instead, he paused, hand on the reins, and looked back at her one last time. "For what it's worth," he said, "you look happier than I've ever seen you. I suppose that counts for something." "It counts for everything," Abigail said. "Just not from you." Silas nodded once, something unreadable in his expression, and turned his horse back toward the road, and Abigail watched him go until the dust of his passage settled and the valley fell quiet again. It was only then, standing beside Caleb in the sudden stillness, that Abigail felt the full weight of everything that had just happened crash down on her at once, her hands beginning to shake now that the confrontation was over, and there was nothing left to brace against. "He came here to steal from you," she said, staring at the empty road. "My own brother rode 300 miles to help a stranger steal from the man I meant to marry, and he didn't even have the decency to feel it was wrong until I said it to his face." "He's not the one who worries me," Caleb said grimly. "Cross is patient. If this attempt failed, he'll try another. Men like him always do." Abigail looked up at him, and something in his expression, tight calculating already 3 steps ahead into whatever came next, told her this confrontation, however dramatic, however painful, was only the opening move in something far larger. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Caleb said, "we make sure every rancher in this valley knows exactly what Wendell Cross has been doing before he manages to steal another inch of water rights out from under folks too scared or too desperate to say no." He looked down at her, something fierce and protective settling into his features. "And we make sure nobody not Cross, not your brother, not anybody ever gets the chance to use you as a pawn in somebody else's scheme again." The truth of just how deep Wendell Cross's scheme ran came to light 2 days later, and it came from a source neither of them expected. Dutch found Abigail alone in the kitchen that morning, hovering in the doorway, with an expression she'd never seen on him before. None of his usual sullen defiance, just a raw, uncertain nervousness that made her set down her rolling pin and give him her full attention. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I expect once I do, the boss'll fire me on the spot, and I expect I'll deserve it." Abigail felt her stomach tighten. "What is it, Dutch?" "Cross has been paying me." Dutch said the words coming fast now, like he needed to get them out before his nerve failed. "Small money, mostly for information. What the boss was planning for the herd when supply runs were happening, that sort of thing. I told myself it wasn't nothing, just gossip, nothing that could really hurt anybody." He swallowed hard. "But 3 nights back in the saloon, Cross asked me about you specific. Asked when the wedding was set for. Asked if I knew anything about your family, whether you had brothers, sisters, anybody back home he might could reach." Abigail's blood went cold. "You told him about Silas." "I didn't know what he meant to do with it," Dutch said miserably. "I swear it, ma'am, I didn't know he meant to use your own brother against you. I thought maybe he was just curious, being a nosy sort of man. I didn't put it together till your brother showed up 2 days back, and by then it was already done and I didn't know how to take it back." Abigail stood very still, working through the anger rising in her chest. The sense of violation at learning her own private history had been sold for saloon money to the very man now trying to destroy Caleb's ranch. "Does Caleb know?" she asked. "Not yet," Dutch admitted. "I came to you first on account of—" He stopped, looking almost embarrassed. "On account of, I figured you deserved to hear it from me straight, ma'am, for I go confess it to him, and likely lose my position over it. Didn't seem right you finding out secondhand." Something in his honesty, however late, however self-serving in its timing, cut through Abigail's anger just enough to let a different feeling through, a grudging, complicated respect for a man finally choosing to do the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "You could have kept quiet. Cross would never have known you'd talked." Dutch's jaw tightened. Because I watched your brother ride in here 2 days back and try to take something from you that weren't his to take. And I watched you stand up to him anyway, scared as you clearly were, and I thought about how I'd been doing the same thing to you and the boss, both just quieter about it, just with money, instead of family obligation, as my excuse. He looked down at his boots. Don't make it right, I know that, but I'd rather tell the truth now and take what's coming than keep on being the kind of man who sells out the people who took him in. Abigail studied him for a long moment, weighing the anger still burning in her chest against the plain, uncomfortable courage of what he'd just done. Come with me, she said finally. Caleb needs to hear this too. All of it. And Dutch? She paused at the doorway, looking back at him. Whatever he decides to do about your position here, you did the right thing telling us. That's not nothing. That's the beginning of something, if you choose to build on it. Dutch nodded, something like relief and shame mingling in his expression, and followed her out to find Caleb. Caleb's reaction, when he heard the full account, was quieter than Abigail expected. Not the explosive anger she'd braced for, but something colder and more focused, the look of a man calculating his next move with careful precision. You'll be docked a month's wages, he told Dutch once the full story had been laid out, and you'll consider yourself on notice, on account of trust once broken. Don't rebuild itself easy. But you told the truth when it cost you something to tell it, and that counts for more than you might think, especially now. His eyes hardened. What else did you tell Cross? Think carefully, Dutch. I need to know exactly what he knows about this operation, because it seems he's been building a far more detailed picture of my affairs than I realized. Dutch spent the better part of an hour recounting every conversation he could remember, every careless comment he'd made over drinks he shouldn't have been drinking on credit. He shouldn't have been extending. And by the end of it, Caleb's expression had gone grim in a way Abigail hadn't seen from him before. He knows the ranch is stretched thin on cash after last winter, Caleb said finally, mostly to himself, working through the implications. He knows about the loan I took out with the bank in Amber Creek to cover the herd losses. He's been building toward calling in favors with that banker I'd wager, same as he's been building toward stealing water rights out from under half this valley. He looked up, meeting Abigail's eyes. This isn't just about your family's old land claim anymore. Cross means to squeeze this ranch from every direction. At once the water, the debt, and now it seems whatever leverage he thought your brother's visit might buy him. What do we do? Abigail asked, echoing the same question she'd asked 2 days before, though the stakes now felt immeasurably higher. Caleb was quiet a long moment, and when he finally spoke, there was a new resolve in his voice, something that had crystallized out of fear into something closer to purpose. We stop being the only ones who know what Cross is doing, he said. I've suspected for months he was working some scheme across this valley, but suspicion isn't proof, and I've had no way to move against a man as careful as him without something solid to stand on. His eyes moved to Dutch. You just handed me the beginnings of that proof. Every payment, every conversation, every detail you can remember, I need it written down, dated as close as you can recall everything. You mean to go to the law? Dutch asked. I mean to go to every rancher in this valley first, Caleb said, because a loan complaint from one ranch is easy for Cross to dismiss or bury. But a dozen ranchers all describing the same pattern, the same pressure, the same slick paperwork designed to confuse honest men into signing away what's theirs, that's not so easy to make disappear. And once we've got that, we take it to the territorial marshal, and if he won't act, we take it clear to the federal land office if that's what it takes. Abigail felt something steady and fierce rise up in her chest at the sight of him laying out the plan, methodical and determined, a man who had spent 5 years alone on a mountain, suddenly remembering exactly how to fight for something worth keeping. I'll go with you, she said, to the other ranches. I want to be part of this, Caleb. Not just something you're protecting someone standing beside you while you do it. Something in Caleb's expression softened, even amid the gravity of the moment. I wouldn't have it any other way. The following days blurred into a whirlwind of activity that left little room for anything but purpose. Caleb and Abigail rode from ranch to ranch across the valley, and at each one they found the same story in different clothes: a widow who'd nearly signed away her late husband's water allotment before a neighbor talked her out of it. A young couple deep in debt to Cross's saloon credit, still deciding whether the papers he'd offered were salvation or trap. An old rancher who'd already signed, already lost his creek frontage, and sat now watching his cattle struggle through a dry pasture with the particular despair of a man who understood too late exactly what he'd given away. "He told me it was a formality," the old man said, bitter and hollow. "Told me the water rights transfer was just clearing up an old survey error. By the time I understood what I'd signed, the ink was dry, and Cross had already sold the parcel on to some outfit out of the territorial capital. I got no recourse. Lawyer I finally hired told me the paperwork was airtight, whatever tricks Cross used to get me there." "It won't stay airtight," Caleb told him. "Not once enough of us stand together and say the same thing happened to each of us in turn. A pattern's harder to call an honest mistake than a single case is." The old man looked at him with the cautious, weary hope of a man who'd given up believing anything could change slowly, deciding whether to let himself believe it again. "You really mean to fight him?" he asked. "Man like Cross has got money behind him, connections clear to the territorial office. Man like me's got nothing but a dry pasture and a mortgage." "I mean to fight him," Caleb said. "And I don't mean to fight him alone, which is exactly why I'm here talking to you, instead of just fuming about it up on my own mountain." He looked around at the gathered faces, the old rancher, his grown son, two neighboring families, who'd ridden over once word spread that Thornton was collecting testimonies. "Every one of you's got a story like his. Every one of you's had something taken, or nearly taken, by a man who counted on you being too scared, too proud, or too alone to fight back. Well, you're not alone anymore. Not if you don't want to be." It was Abigail, though, who found the moment that shifted the room from cautious interest into real resolve, standing forward unbidden and speaking in a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had finally run out of patience for it. "I know what it feels like," she said, "to have someone decide what you're worth without ever asking you, to have your own family sell you out because it was easier than standing up for you. I know what it costs to keep quiet about it too, the fear that speaking up just makes everything worse, that nobody will believe you, that you're the only one it's happened to." She looked around at the weathered, wary faces. "But every one of you standing here right now is proof that it isn't just you. It isn't just me. It's a whole valley of good, hard-working people that one greedy man decided he could pick apart one scared, desperate signature at a time. That only works if we stay scared and desperate and alone. It stops working the second we stop." The silence that followed her words held a different quality than before. Not doubt, but the particular stillness of people recalculating what was possible. "She's right," the old rancher's son said finally. "My pa's been carrying this alone for a year, ashamed to even talk about it, thinking it made him a fool. Turns out half the valley's got the same shame sitting on their chest for the same reason. Ain't no shame in being tricked by a man who's made a whole career out of tricking folks smarter than any of us." By the end of that week, Caleb and Abigail had gathered testimony from 11 different ranches, a growing ledger of dates and details and broken promises that painted a picture far uglier and far more calculated than even Caleb had initially suspected. Wendell Cross, it turned out, had been running some version of this scheme for nearly 2 years, moving from valley to valley across the territory. Always careful, always just within the letter of a law, he understood far better than the people he preyed upon. It was on their ride back from the last ranch dusk, settling purple and gold across the valley, that Abigail finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion the week had cost her, and beneath the exhaustion, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "We're actually going to stop him," she said half to herself, testing the words like she wasn't sure she believed them yet. "We're going to try," Caleb said, though there was real conviction underneath the caution in his voice. "Testimony's not the same as a conviction, Abigail. Cross has resources connections. This isn't over just because we've got 11 ranchers willing to speak against him. I know that." She looked over at him, the last light catching the tired, determined lines of his face. "But a week ago, I thought the biggest fight of my life was going to be convincing myself I deserve to be happy here with you. Now I'm helping lead a fight against a man who's been robbing an entire valley blind, and somehow that feels less impossible than the first fight did." Caleb reached over, taking her hand from the reins, his calloused fingers wrapping warm and steady around hers. "Maybe that's on account of you've spent your whole life fighting battles nobody else could see," he said quietly. "Fighting to be believed you were worth something, fighting to hold your head up when everybody around you was working hard to make you put it down. This fight at least folks can see plain. At least this time you're not fighting it alone." Abigail felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, and she blinked them back, grateful and overwhelmed in equal measure. They were nearly back to the ranch, the house just coming into view against the darkening sky, when Otis came riding out to meet them at a pace that told Abigail immediately something was wrong. "Boss," Otis called out, breathless, his horse lathered from a hard ride. "Message came for you from town not an hour past. Bank's calling in your loan. Full amount due within the week, or they're foreclosing on the ranch." Caleb went very still beside her. "That loan's not due for another 8 months, he said. "I've never missed a payment on it in 3 years. "I know, boss," Otis said grimly. "But the letter's signed by the bank president himself, and it names a specific reason for the acceleration, says the bank's received information calling into question the ranch's water rights and therefore its collateral value." He hesitated. "Boss, I asked around some before I rode back. Word in town is Wendell Cross had a private meeting with that same bank president 2 days ago." Abigail felt the full cold weight of it settle over her at once. Cross, learning his scheme, had been exposed to a growing chorus of angry ranchers striking back, not through the courts or the marshal, but through the one avenue Caleb hadn't thought to protect: the ranch itself. "He means to take it before we can stop him," Caleb said very quietly, very dangerously. "If he can force a foreclosure fast enough, he doesn't need my water rights signed away legal and proper. He just needs the bank to seize the whole property outright, and then he can buy it clean off the bank's hands for Penny's testimony, or no testimony ranchers, or no ranchers standing against him." "Can he do that?" Abigail asked. "Can he really force the bank to move that fast?" Caleb's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon, like he could see somewhere out there the shape of the fight now bearing down on all of them at once. "I don't know," he said, "but I know we've got 1 week to find out." Caleb didn't sleep that night. Abigail found him at the kitchen table well past midnight. A lamp burned low beside him. Papers spread out across the wood. The loan documents from 3 years back. Ledgers, the growing stack of testimony they'd gathered from ranchers up and down the valley. "You should rest," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Can't." He didn't look up from the papers. "If the bank forecloses inside a week, I need to know exactly what ground I've got to stand on before then. Every clause, every date, every payment I've made on time for 3 years running. Man doesn't get to steal a ranch out from under a family just because he's got a friend behind a desk." Abigail reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, stilling the restless shuffling of papers. "Caleb, look at me." He did finally, and she saw the exhaustion carved into his face, the particular fear of a man who had already lost everything once before and was terrified of watching it happen again. "We're going to figure this out," she said. "Together. The way we've done everything else this past week." "This is different," Caleb said, and his voice cracked slightly, betraying more than he probably intended. "Ranchers testifying against Cross, that's a fight, I understand. But a bank calling in a loan that's paper and ink and men in offices deciding my family's future without ever once looking me in the eye. I don't know how to fight that kind of enemy, Abigail. I know how to fight a man with fists or a rifle. I don't rightly know how to fight a signature." "Then we find somebody who does," Abigail said simply. Caleb looked at her, something considering moving behind his tired eyes. "What do you mean?" "You said the territorial marshal might not act on local testimony alone," she said. "You said if he wouldn't, we'd go to the federal land office. Why wait for the bank to force our hand? Why not ride out ahead of it? Take everything we've gathered straight to whoever has the authority to stop both the foreclosure and Cross's whole scheme at once. Federal Land Office is 4 days' ride from here, Caleb said. Bank's giving us a week. That leaves no room for anything going wrong along the way. Then we'd best not let anything go wrong, Abigail said, and something in her steady, unshakable tone seemed to settle something in him, some of the wild fear in his eyes, banking down into determination instead. You'd come with me, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Try and stop me. Caleb almost smiled, exhausted as he was. I wouldn't dream of it. They left before dawn. Caleb, Abigail, and Otis with the ledger of testimonies packed carefully in a leather satchel, and the loan papers folded inside Caleb's coat close to his chest, like something he couldn't risk losing. Dutch stayed behind to watch the ranch, a responsibility Caleb had given him, with more trust than the younger man's recent history probably earned, but which Dutch had accepted with a solemnity that suggested he understood exactly what kind of second chance he'd been handed. You sure about leaving him in charge? Abigail asked quietly as they rode out past the barn. No, Caleb admitted. But a man's got to be given the chance to prove he's changed, or he never will. Besides, he glanced back at the ranch, shrinking behind them. Ain't much left to steal if Cross is already moving on the bank to take the whole thing outright. Dutch selling secrets for saloon money seems the least of my worries just now. The ride was hard and fast, the kind of pace that left little room for conversation, and Abigail found herself grateful for it, in a strange way. The physical exhaustion of long days in the saddle kept the deeper fear at bay, kept her from spiraling too far into imagining what it would mean if they failed, if the bank seized the ranch before they could reach anyone with the power to stop it. They stopped only when the horses needed rest, made camp in the open when no town offered shelter, and on the second night huddled close to a small fire, with the mountains dark and silent around them. Abigail found Caleb watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something raw and unguarded, stripped bare by exhaustion and fear in a way his usual careful composure didn't allow. I need to tell you something, he said, in case this doesn't go the way we're hoping. Don't talk like that. I mean it, Abigail. I need you to hear this. He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, his grip firmer than usual, almost desperate. If Cross wins this, if the bank takes the ranch before we can stop it, I don't want you thinking for one moment that any of it changes what's between us. I didn't choose you because of a ranch or a house or anything I could lose to a man like Cross. I chose you because you walked into my life and made me remember what it felt like to want something again, instead of just enduring. His thumb traced slow circles against her palm. Whatever happens with the land, that part isn't going anywhere. I need you to know that plain and clear before we ride into whatever's waiting for us. Abigail felt tears rise hot and sudden, and she didn't bother fighting them this time. We're not going to lose the ranch, Caleb. Maybe not, he said. But I've learned the hard way that a man can lose things he loves even when he does everything right to keep them. I lost Rachel doing everything right. Sat by her bed, prayed every prayer I knew, and it wasn't enough. So I need you to hear me say this now, while I've got the chance, instead of waiting to see if we win first. His voice roughened. I love you, Abigail Whitmore. Not the version of you your brothers decided you were. Not some consolation prize a desperate rancher settled for. You, exactly as you are. And no bank, no land agent, no scheme in this territory is going to change that truth, whatever else they manage to take from us. Abigail closed the distance between them and kissed him fierce and certain, pouring every unspoken fear and hope of the past weeks into it. And when they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, she pressed her forehead to his. I love you too, she said. And we are going to win this. Not because I'm certain of it, because I refuse to imagine losing you now after finally finding you. That's not a fear I intend to make peace with. Caleb held her close under the vast mountain sky, and for a moment, the fear that had ridden alongside them for 2 hard days eased, just slightly replaced by something steadier. Not certainty, but resolve. The particular strength that comes from facing a fight beside someone who has already chosen to stand with you, no matter its outcome. They reached the territorial capital on the morning of the fourth day, exhausted, saddle-sore, and immediately confronted with the particular frustration of government offices that moved at their own unhurried pace, regardless of the urgency pressing on the people seeking their help. "Land office don't open till 9. The clerk at the front desk informed them, barely glancing up from his ledger. "And Commissioner Hale's got appointments booked solid through Thursday if you're wanting to see him personal." "This can't wait until Thursday." Caleb said, his patience fraying visibly after 4 days of hard riding and harder worry. "A bank's set to foreclose on my property inside 3 days' time based on false information provided by a land agent running a fraud scheme across this entire valley. I've got sworn testimony from 11 different ranchers to prove it." The clerk's expression didn't change. "I'm sure that's real serious, mister, but the commissioner's schedule." "Is there someone else?" Abigail interrupted, stepping forward with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "Who handles matters of this urgency? Fraud specifically involving federal land claims and water rights." The clerk hesitated, something in Abigail's steady, direct manner, apparently cutting through his rehearsed indifference more effectively than Caleb's mounting frustration had. "There's a federal marshal's office 2 doors down," he said finally. "Marshal Boone handles land fraud matters when they cross county lines. Might could see you sooner if it's as urgent as you're saying." It was, as it turned out, considerably more complicated than simply walking 2 doors down. Marshal Boone, a weathered man in his 50s with sharp assessing eyes, listened to their account with careful attention, but made no promises, methodically working through the satchel of testimonies with the deliberate pace of a man who had seen enough false accusations to know better than to act on emotion alone. "This is substantial," he admitted finally, after nearly an hour of review. "Assuming it holds up. 11 separate accounts, all describing the same pattern of misrepresented paperwork, same name involved throughout." He looked up at them. "But I'll be honest with you both, fraud cases like this move slow, even when the evidence is strong. Courts want their own investigation, their own confirmation. I can't simply ride out and arrest Wendell Cross on the strength of testimony alone, however convincing. We don't have time for slow," Caleb said, urgency sharpening every word. "The bank's set to foreclose on my ranch inside 3 days. Marshal Boone considered this, tapping the stack of papers thoughtfully. "The bank matter at least might move faster than the fraud investigation itself. If I send an official notice to the bank informing them that the water rights information they received is currently under federal investigation for fraud, that alone might be enough to stay the foreclosure until matters are properly sorted." Banks tend to grow considerably more cautious when the word federal investigation enters the conversation. "Some bitumau," Boomo said. "Can you send that today?" Abigail asked. "I can send it within the hour," Boone said, "though I'll warn you, a notice like this only buys time. It doesn't resolve the underlying claim, and it certainly doesn't stop a man like Cross from trying some other angle if this one's blocked." "Time's exactly what we need right now," Caleb said. "We'll worry about the rest after we've kept the roof over our heads." Marshal Boone nodded, already reaching for paper and pen. "I'll have my deputy write it out personally, make sure it reaches the bank president's hands directly, rather than getting lost in some clerk's inbox for a week. Should reach Amber Creek within 2 days, well ahead of your deadline." Relief flooded through Abigail so intensely, her knees nearly buckled with it, and she felt Caleb's arm come around her, steadying her, both of them allowing themselves, for the first time in days, a small measure of hope. "There's one more thing," Marshal Boone said before they could fully sink into that relief. "This investigation, once it's formally opened, will need witnesses willing to testify in person, likely before a circuit judge once the evidence is fully gathered. I won't lie to you, Cross has resources, and men like that don't go down easy or quiet. He'll fight this every step, probably try to intimidate witnesses into recanting, maybe worse. The ranchers already knew that risk when they gave their testimony," Caleb said. "Every one of them chose to speak anyway." "Good," Boone said, "because I suspect we'll need every one of them standing firm before this is finished." The ride back to the ranch felt different than the ride out. Still urgent, still weighted with uncertainty about what exactly awaited them, but carried now on the strength of real progress instead of desperate hope alone. They pushed the horses hard, driven by the knowledge that even with Marshal Boone's notice on its way to the bank, 3 days left little margin for anything to go further wrong. They arrived back at Thornton Ranch on the evening of the 6th day, exhausted beyond words, to find Otis waiting anxiously on the porch and Dutch pacing the yard with an expression of barely contained agitation. "Boss?" Dutch said, hurrying forward before Caleb had even fully dismounted. "You need to know what's happened while you were gone." Caleb's exhausted relief at seeing the ranch still standing curdled instantly back into wariness. "What is it?" "Cross came by," Dutch said, 2 days back. Brought the bank's foreclosure agent with him, said they were within their rights to do a preliminary assessment of the property ahead of the seizure. I couldn't rightly stop them without breaking the law myself, so I let them look around, but boss—" He hesitated, something almost frightened moving across his face. "Cross made it real clear he means to have this land. Said something about how a smart man knows when to stop fighting a fight he can't win. Said to tell you when you got back that there's still time to sell willing before things get ugly." "That's a threat," Abigail said, cold fury cutting through her exhaustion. "That's exactly what it is," Caleb agreed grimly. "Cross knows we've gone to the federal marshal by now, or at least suspects it. This visit wasn't about assessing property. It was about intimidation, plain and simple, making sure we understand he's still willing to fight dirty, even with federal eyes starting to turn his direction." "There's more," Dutch said, and his voice dropped lower, more uncertain. "One of the ranchers who gave testimony, Old Man Foster, the one whose water rights got stolen outright last year, his barn burned down last night. Whole thing gone before anybody could get water to it. Foster's saying it was lightning, but there weren't no storm that night, boss. Not a cloud in the sky." The implication settled heavy and ugly over all of them. Cross apparently had decided that intimidation wasn't limited to veiled threats delivered through hired hands. Someone, whether Cross himself or men working at his direction, had escalated to outright violence against the very witnesses whose testimony threatened to unravel his entire scheme. "We need to get to Foster," Abigail said immediately. "Make sure he's safe. Make sure his family's safe. And warn the other ranchers," Caleb added, already moving toward a fresh horse despite the exhaustion still heavy in his own body. If Cross is willing to burn a man's barn to send a message, he might not stop there. Every rancher who testified needs to know the danger's real, now not hypothetical. They rode out again within the hour, exhausted bodies pushed past their limits by the urgent fear that Cross's intimidation campaign might already be spreading further than they knew. They found Old Man Foster's family shaken but unharmed the barn, a smoking ruin behind the farmhouse. Foster himself, standing amid the wreckage with the particular hollow expression of a man weighing whether his testimony was worth the price being extracted for it. "I ain't sure I can keep standing against him," Foster admitted quietly, once Caleb and Abigail had confirmed his family's safety. "I got a wife and 4 children under this roof, Thornton. Barn's one thing. Next time it might be the house itself with all of us still in it." "I understand your fear," Caleb said, and Abigail could hear the genuine weight of empathy in his voice. Not empty reassurance, but real acknowledgement of the impossible position Foster found himself in. "Nobody would blame you for pulling back your testimony to protect your family. That's not weakness, Foster. That's a father doing right by the people depending on him. But," Abigail added, stepping forward, "if every witness pulls back out of fear, Cross wins simply by being cruel enough, and he'll go right on doing this to the next valley and the next and the next for as long as fear works better than the truth does. We can offer you protection, Mr. Foster. We can't offer you certainty. But I promise you this, whatever you decide, we won't think less of you for choosing your family's safety." Foster looked between them for a long moment, something working behind his tired eyes. "Let me talk to my wife," he said finally. "This decision ain't mine alone to make." They left him to that conversation and rode on through the night, warning ranch after ranch, arranging for men to take shifts watching each other's properties, building a network of mutual protection out of the same solidarity that had produced the testimonies in the first place. By the time dawn broke gray and exhausted over the valley, Caleb and Abigail had visited nearly every ranch on their list and word had spread fast enough that Cross's intimidation, rather than silencing the growing coalition against him, seemed instead to be hardening their collective resolve. "He's making a mistake," Caleb said as they finally turned their tired horses back toward home in the pale early light. "Man like Cross used to folks caving quiet under pressure. He doesn't understand that burning one barn just proves every word we've said about him true. Folks were uncertain before. Now they've seen exactly what he's capable of." "Let's hope that's enough," Abigail said, "before he decides burning barns isn't enough either." The bank's response, when it finally came, arrived not as the immediate stay they'd hoped for, but as something more complicated: a letter informing Caleb that the foreclosure was suspended pending federal investigation, but that the bank president himself wished to meet personally to discuss certain irregularities in how the original loan had been structured. "Irregularities," Caleb said, grimly reading the letter at the kitchen table, while Abigail poured coffee with hands that had finally stopped shaking from the exhaustion of the past week. "That's Cross's language if I ever heard it. Man's probably already been in that banker's ear trying to find some other angle to squeeze now that the water rights scheme's stalled. When does he want to meet?" "Tomorrow, in town." Caleb set the letter down, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. "I don't like it. Feels like walking into a trap laid by men who've had a week's head start planning it." "Then we don't walk in unprepared," Abigail said. "We bring the testimonies. We bring anything Marshal Boone's given us in writing. We make certain that whatever irregularities this banker thinks he's found, we've got answers ready before he even finishes asking the questions." Caleb looked at her, something admiring and grateful moving across his tired features. "You've got a mind for this kind of fight. I don't know that I'd have thought half so clearly this deep into exhaustion. I've spent my whole life learning to see attacks coming before they land," Abigail said, quiet and honest. "Seems that particular skill's finally found a use worth having." The meeting the next morning, held in the bank president's cramped formal office in Amber Creek, proved every bit as tense as Caleb had feared. Bank President Harmon Whitfield was a thin, careful man who spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news without appearing to take responsibility for delivering it. "I want to be clear, Mr. Thornton," Whitfield began, "that this bank has no desire to seize property from a customer with an otherwise spotless payment history. However, certain information has come to light suggesting the collateral securing your loan may be worth considerably less than originally assessed, given the ongoing dispute over water rights access." "There is no dispute," Caleb said, controlled but firm. "There's a fraud scheme run by a man who's been systematically stealing water rights from ranchers across this entire valley through misleading paperwork and outright intimidation. My property's water access has never been legitimately in question, only falsely called into question by the very man now apparently whispering in your ear about irregularities." Whitfield's composure flickered slightly. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thornton." "It's a documented one," Caleb said, and pushed the satchel of testimonies across the desk. 11 ranchers' sworn accounts, all describing the same pattern from the same man. Marshal Boone's already opened a federal investigation. I'd wager Wendell Cross hasn't mentioned that particular detail during whatever conversation prompted this meeting. Whitfield's eyes moved over the papers with growing unease, his careful composure cracking further as he read account after account of the same fraudulent scheme playing out across the valley. "Mr. Cross approached me 3 weeks ago," Whitfield admitted finally, expressing concern about several loans this bank held against properties in this valley, suggesting the water rights underlying much of the collateral were less secure than assumed. He offered to purchase several of these loans outright at a discount, presumably intending to force the issue on his own terms once he held the paper directly. "He wanted to buy your bad debt," Abigail said, understanding dawning cold and clear, "so that when the ranchers couldn't pay because he'd already stolen the water that made their land valuable in the first place, he'd own the foreclosed properties outright without ever having to go through you at all." Whitfield looked between them, something like genuine alarm finally breaking through his careful banker's neutrality. "If what you're describing is accurate, this bank has very nearly become complicit in a scheme to defraud half the ranchers in this valley." "It has," Caleb said, "unless you're willing to help stop it instead." Whitfield sat back in his chair, clearly recalculating the entire situation in light of what he'd just learned. "What would you have me do, Mr. Thornton?" "Formally suspend any consideration of purchasing loans from Wendell Cross," Caleb said. "Provide Marshal Boone with copies of whatever records exist regarding Cross's approach to this bank, his offers, his claims about water rights, anything that shows the scope of what he's been attempting. And confirm in writing that my loan remains in good standing with no further irregularities to be raised, absent actual evidence, not innuendo, from a man now under federal investigation." Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request against whatever business relationship he'd hoped to preserve with Cross, and Abigail found herself holding her breath, watching the banker's careful calculation play out across his face. "I'll do it," Whitfield said finally. "Frankly, Mr. Thornton, I don't relish the idea of this bank's name attached to a federal fraud investigation as a willing participant rather than a victim who acted responsibly once informed. You'll have your written confirmation before you leave town today, and I'll have my clerk prepare copies of every document related to Cross's proposals for the marshal's office by week's end." Relief washed through Abigail so completely she felt almost lightheaded with it. And beside her, Caleb's shoulders finally lowered from the tense, braced posture he'd carried since the bank's letter first arrived. "Thank you," Caleb said, extending his hand across the desk, "for doing the right thing even once it became the harder thing." Whitfield shook it, something almost apologetic in his expression. "I should have asked harder questions from the start. That's on me, not you. Good luck, Mr. Thornton. I hope the marshal's investigation gives this whole valley the resolution it deserves." They walked out of the bank into the bright midday sun, feeling for the first time in over a week like the ground beneath them had finally stopped shifting. Abigail turned to Caleb and found him watching her with an expression of such open relief and gratitude that her breath caught. "We did it," she said, half disbelieving. "The ranch is safe. For now," Caleb said, though even his caution couldn't fully dampen the relief evident in his voice. "Cross's fraud scheme still needs to play out through the marshal's investigation. This isn't finished, but—" He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, right there on the main street of Amber Creek, unbothered now by whoever might be watching. "The immediate threat's past. My home's not being ripped away from under us today or tomorrow, or any time soon, thanks in no small part to you. To us," Abigail corrected gently. Caleb smiled, real and unguarded, the particular smile she'd come to treasure over these past weeks, precisely because it came so rarely and meant so much when it did. "To us," he agreed. They were still standing there, hands linked, when Otis came riding hard into town. His horse lathered with the effort of a fast journey, and something in his expression immediately extinguished the fragile relief they'd just allowed themselves. "Boss?" Otis called out, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Marshal Boone's man just rode into the ranch looking for you. Cross has been arrested." The words landed with such unexpected force that for a moment Abigail simply stared, certain she must have misheard. "Arrested," she repeated. "Already, turns out," Otis said, still catching his breath. Cross weren't quite so careful as he thought. Foster's barn burning, turns out one of the men who said it got caught trying to skip town, and rather than hang for arson alone, he gave up Cross as the one who paid him to do it. Once Boone had that confession in hand, tied directly to Cross, ordering violence against a federal witness, he didn't need to wait on the slower fraud investigation at all. Rode out with 2 deputies and arrested Cross at his office in the territorial capital not 2 days past. Abigail felt the relief crash over her so completely her knees nearly buckled, and Caleb's arm came around her immediately, steady and strong, holding her upright through the overwhelming wave of it. "It's over," she said, disbelieving. "Caleb, it's actually over. The arrest is just the beginning of the legal proceedings," Caleb cautioned, though even his careful reserve couldn't fully mask the profound relief evident in every line of his body. "There'll be a trial. The ranchers will still need to testify, likely before a circuit judge, to see the fraud charges through properly. But," He looked down at Abigail, something fierce and grateful moving across his face. The man who tried to steal this valley out from under all of us, who tried to use your own family against you, who burned an innocent man's barn to silence the truth, he's finally facing consequences for it. That's no small thing, Abigail. That's everything we rode 4 days to try and secure, and more besides. Otis, still catching his breath, added one more detail that settled something even deeper in Abigail's chest. Marshall's man said something else too, boss. Said your brother-in-law Whitmore, that has showed up at the marshal's office in the capital just yesterday on his own offering to testify about how Cross had used his debt to pressure him into targeting his own sister, said he wanted to make it right best he could. Abigail stood very still, processing this unexpected turn. Silas testified against Cross willingly. Way the marshal's man told it, yes, ma'am, Otis said. Said your brother looked about as ashamed as a man could look giving that account. Said he kept saying he didn't understand what he'd been part of until it was too late to undo it, but he wanted the record straight regardless. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. The wound of her family's casual cruelty ran too deep to be undone by one act of belated conscience. But something in Abigail eased slightly at the news anyway, some old tired part of her that had spent a lifetime hoping, however faintly, that her family might someday prove capable of choosing better. Maybe there's hope for him yet, she said quietly. Not for what he did, but for what he might still choose to become, now that he's finally seen clearly what kind of man he's been. Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and warm. That's a bigger grace than most folks would offer after everything he put you through. I've had a good teacher, Abigail said, looking up at him, in the matter of choosing grace over grudges, even when grudges would be easier. They rode back toward the ranch that afternoon in the golden light of late summer. The valley spread wide and green, and finally blessedly safe. Around them, the immediate danger passed, even as the fuller resolution of justice still lay ahead, in whatever courtroom awaited Wendell Cross's reckoning. Abigail felt something settle deep in her chest as the ranch house came into view. Not just relief at the danger averted, but something steadier and more permanent. The particular piece of a woman who had finally truly found the place and the person she was meant to belong to. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the mountains, and the whole exhausted, grateful household gathered for a supper that felt for the first time in weeks, genuinely unburdened by fear, Caleb rose from his seat at the head of the table and cleared his throat, drawing every eye in the room. I've got something to say, he announced, and Abigail watched, heart suddenly racing as he came around the table to stand before her chair, reaching into his coat pocket for something small that caught the lamplight as he drew it out. This was my mother's, he said, holding out a simple gold ring, worn soft with age, but beautiful in its plainness. She wore it near 40 years through hard winters and harder losses, and she always told me a ring like this wasn't about show. It was about promise, about choosing somebody plain and clear, and meaning to keep choosing them every day after. He knelt beside her chair, and the whole table fell silent, even Otis's usual chatter stilled by the weight of the moment. Abigail Whitmore, I already told you on that ridge I meant to keep you if you'd let me. I'm asking you now properly in front of the folks who've come to matter to both of us. Will you marry me? Not because your family arranged it, and not because either of us was desperate for something convenient. Because I love you plain and complete, exactly as you are, and I mean to go on loving you for the rest of whatever years I've got left to give. Abigail felt tears streaming freely down her face, joy overwhelming every other emotion of the long, harrowing week behind them. Yes, she said, laughing and crying all at once. Caleb Thornton, yes, 1,000 times, yes. The kitchen erupted into celebration. Otis whooping loud enough to startle the chickens outside Dutch, grinning wider than Abigail had ever seen from him. And as Caleb slipped his mother's ring onto her finger and rose to pull her into his arms, Abigail let herself finally fully believe what she had spent a lifetime doubting. She was not the joke her family had made her out to be. She was not a burden handed off to whoever would take her. She was finally entirely exactly where she was meant to be chosen, wanted and loved by a mountain cowboy who had seen her plane from the very first moment and never once looked away. The morning after Caleb's proposal, Abigail woke with her mother's ring lying warm against her palm, where she'd fallen asleep, clutching it, still half convinced the whole evening had been some fevered dream, born of exhaustion and relief. She sat up, and the ring caught the early light through her window gold and real and solid, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It hadn't been a dream. She found Caleb already in the kitchen, same as every morning. But there was something different in the way he looked up when she entered, softer, unguarded, like a man who had spent 5 years bracing against hope and had finally cautiously set that burden down. "Morning, future Mrs. Thornton," he said, and the words still seemed to catch him slightly by surprise, even as he said them like he was testing their weight. "That's going to take some getting used to," Abigail admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "Take all the time you need," Caleb said. "I intend to keep saying it regardless on account of I like the sound of it a good deal." Their quiet happiness didn't last long before the weight of what still lay ahead settled back over the kitchen table. Otis arrived not long after with word from Town Marshal Boone had sent a rider confirming that a circuit judge would be arriving in Amber Creek within the week to hear the fraud case against Wendell Cross, and every rancher who had given testimony would be expected to appear in person. "Trial's set for 6 days from now," Otis reported, laying the marshal's letter on the table. "Judge Renfield riding the circuit down from the Capitol. Word is, he don't tolerate foolishness, which I reckon is good news for us and bad news for Cross." 6 days, Caleb repeated, glancing at Abigail. "That's cutting it close to when we'd hoped to have the preacher through for the wedding. Preacher Coleman's circuit brings him through Amber Creek the same week, far as I know," Otis offered. "Might could arrange both in the same trip to town, if you're of a mind to." Abigail felt a strange, giddy laugh bubble up in her chest at the absurdity of it, planning a wedding and a fraud trial, in the same breath joy and justice arriving hand in hand, whether either of them had planned it that way or not. "Only in this valley," she said, "would a woman find herself arranging her wedding around a courtroom schedule." "Only in this valley," Caleb agreed. "Would I have it any other way?" The days leading up to the trial passed in a blur of preparation, both practical and emotional. Abigail spent her mornings finalizing wedding arrangements with a handful of the ranch wives who had become over these past turbulent weeks something closer to friends than mere neighbors, women who had stood beside her at those difficult gatherings across the valley, who had watched her hold her ground against Cross's intimidation, and found in her apparently someone worth rallying around. "Never thought I'd see the day Beatrice Ashford asked after somebody's happiness with anything resembling sincerity," Otis remarked one afternoon, having overheard the town matron inquiring about wedding preparations with none of her earlier condescension. "Reckon standing up to Cross in public did more for your standing in this valley than 100 quiet years of minding your own business ever could have." "Funny thing about courage," Abigail said. "Folks respect it, even the ones who wouldn't dream of showing any themselves." But beneath the wedding preparations ran a current of real anxiety about the trial ahead. Caleb spent his evenings reviewing testimony with Marshal Boone's traveling deputy, making certain every rancher's account was consistent, prepared, ready to withstand whatever defense Cross's lawyers might mount. "He'll have good counsel," Caleb warned the assembled ranchers gathered one evening in Thornton Ranch's front room for a final preparation before the trial. "Man like Cross doesn't build a scheme this elaborate without the resources to defend it when it finally comes apart. His lawyers will try to poke holes wherever they can find them. Inconsistencies in dates, disputes about exactly what was said and when. Stay calm, stay honest. Don't let them rattle you into saying more than you actually know to be true." Old Man Foster, still rebuilding his burned barn, with help from half the valley's ranchers, spoke up from his seat near the fire. "What if they try to say the barn burning weren't connected to Cross at all? Just some accident or some other enemy I might have made along the way. The man who set the fire already confessed and named Cross as the one who paid him," Caleb reminded him. "That confession's sworn and on record with Marshal Boone. Cross's lawyers can try to muddy the water, but they can't erase a signed confession any more than they can erase 11 separate accounts, all describing the same pattern of fraud. Dutch, seated near the back of the room, spoke up for the first time that evening, his voice steadier than Abigail had ever heard it. "I'll testify too if it helps. About the money Cross paid me for information. About what he asked specific regarding Miss Whitmore's family. I know it makes me look about as low as a man can look taking money like that, but I figure the truth's worth more than my pride at this point." Caleb looked at him for a long moment, something like genuine respect moving across his weathered face. "That takes more courage than you might think, Dutch. Standing up in a courtroom and admitting your own part in something ugly just to help set the larger wrong right. I'm grateful for it." The room fell quiet for a moment, weighted with the shared understanding of what all of them were about to walk into a fight, not just for individual justice, but for the entire valley's future, for the principle that a man with money and connections couldn't simply steal from honest, hardworking people and expect to walk away unaccountable. "We're ready," Abigail said, finally breaking the silence. "Every one of us has already survived the hardest part, deciding to speak the truth despite the fear of what it might cost. Whatever happens in that courtroom, we've already won something just by refusing to stay silent." Bud. The trial began on a bright, clear morning that felt almost mockingly cheerful, given the gravity of what was about to unfold inside the small, packed courtroom in Amber Creek. Judge Renfield proved every bit as no-nonsense as his reputation suggested, a stern, weathered man who moved the proceedings along with brisk efficiency, cutting off theatrical objections and irrelevant tangents with a sharpness that left Cross's expensive lawyer visibly frustrated within the first hour. Abigail sat beside Caleb in the crowded gallery, watching Wendell Cross across the room for the first time since their brief, unsettling encounter on the streets of Amber Creek weeks earlier. He looked smaller than she remembered, stripped of the calculated confidence that had made him seem so dangerous before, though his eyes still held that same cold, assessing quality as they swept across the room, cataloging threats and weaknesses, even now. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically through the morning, rancher after rancher taking the stand to describe the same pattern of misleading paperwork, false urgency, and quiet intimidation that had characterized Cross's scheme across the valley. Old Man Foster's testimony about his burned barn drew visible sympathy from the gathered spectators, and when the confessed arsonist's sworn statement was read into the record, directly implicating Cross in ordering the violence, a murmur of anger rippled through the courtroom that Judge Renfield had to gavel down twice. It was Dutch's testimony, though, that seemed to land with the most unexpected weight. He stood in the witness box, visibly nervous but resolute, and recounted in detail every payment he'd received from Cross, every question Cross had asked about Abigail's family, every piece of information he'd carelessly traded away without understanding the harm it might eventually cause. "Why come forward now?" the prosecutor asked him, "when you could have simply stayed quiet and let this trial proceed without your involvement at all?" Dutch glanced toward Caleb and Abigail in the gallery before answering. "Because I watched a good man and a good woman nearly lose everything they'd built, partly on account of information I sold cheap without thinking hard about where it might lead. Man's got to own up to his part in a wrong, even the small parts, if he ever means to call himself decent again." Cross's lawyer, a sharp-featured man from the territorial capital, attempted to discredit Dutch's testimony on cross-examination, suggesting he was simply trying to curry favor with his employer after being caught in his own wrongdoing. But Dutch held steady under the questioning, and something in his plain, unpolished honesty seemed to carry more weight with the jury than any amount of legal maneuvering could undermine. The afternoon brought a moment none of them had fully anticipated: Silas Whitmore taking the stand, dressed in his best coat, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of every eye in the courtroom, including his sister's. "Mr. Whitmore," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the circumstances under which Wendell Cross approached you regarding your sister's signature on certain land documents?" Silas's account when it came was halting, but complete the debt he owed Cross, the pressure to deliver Abigail's signature, the vague, misleading explanation he'd been given about the papers he'd carried 300 miles to present. He didn't spare himself in the telling, didn't try to minimize his own poor judgment or the callousness with which he'd treated his sister for most of her life. I let a man's debt make my decisions for me," Silas said, his voice rough with something that sounded to Abigail's genuine surprise like real shame. I didn't ask hard enough questions about what I was being asked to do, because the easy answer was more convenient than the honest one. That's on me, not just Cross, but he knew exactly what kind of desperate, foolish man he was dealing with, and he used it deliberate. When Silas finally stepped down from the witness box, he looked toward Abigail in the gallery, and for the first time in her memory, she saw something in her brother's expression that resembled genuine remorse, rather than the calculated performance of it he'd offered on the ranch weeks before. She didn't smile at him. She wasn't ready for that, not yet, perhaps not ever entirely. But she gave him a small acknowledging nod, and something in Silas's shoulders eased slightly, like a man accepting whatever partial grace was being offered, without demanding more than had actually been given. Chebd. Cross's defense, when it finally came, proved considerably weaker than his lawyer's confident opening had promised. Attempts to portray the water rights transfers as legitimate business transactions crumbled under the sheer weight of consistent testimony from 11 separate ranchers, all describing nearly identical tactics of confusion and false urgency. Attempts to distance Cross from the barn burning fell apart entirely once the arsonist's detailed, corroborated confession was fully entered into evidence. It was during the final day of testimony, as the prosecution prepared to rest its case, that the trial took its sharpest and most unexpected turn. A woman Abigail had never seen before rose from the back of the courtroom requesting permission to address the court, and Judge Renfield, curious, despite his usual brisk efficiency, allowed her forward. "My name is Margaret Cross," the woman said, and a startled murmur swept through the gallery. I was Wendell Cross's wife. We've been separated 2 years now, though the divorce was never finalized on account of he refused to sign the papers." She looked directly at her husband, across the courtroom, and something cold and determined settled over her features. "I have documents. Ledgers he kept at our home in the capital before I finally left him. They detail every scheme like the ones described here today, not just in this valley, but in 3 others, before it going back nearly 5 years. I kept them because I always suspected someday somebody would need proof of exactly what kind of man I'd married, and I didn't want to be the only one who knew it." The courtroom erupted into stunned murmurs, and Judge Renfield had to gavel for order twice before the room settled enough for Margaret Cross to continue. "I'm ashamed I didn't come forward sooner," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly, but not breaking. "I told myself it wasn't my business anymore once I'd left him. Told myself I'd protected myself, and that was enough. But when I heard about a whole valley of ranchers standing up together against him, when I heard about a young woman brave enough to stand against her own family's cruelty and speak the truth anyway." Her eyes found Abigail's across the crowded room. "I realized I owed this valley the same courage that woman showed. I should have come forward years ago. I'm here now, at least before more harm could be done." Wendell Cross's composure, which had held through days of damaging testimony, finally cracked entirely at his estranged wife's words, his face going pale and furious in equal measure, as she handed the bailiff a thick, damning ledger, documenting years of identical fraud across multiple territories. "This is exactly the kind of pattern evidence this court needs," Judge Renfield said, examining the ledger with growing gravity. "Mr. Cross, it would appear your scheme in this valley was neither your first attempt at this particular fraud, nor had it succeeded likely to have been your last." The defense's case, already faltering, collapsed entirely under the weight of this final devastating testimony. By the time closing arguments concluded late that afternoon, even Cross's own lawyer seemed to have largely abandoned any real hope of acquittal. His final statement reduced to vague appeals for leniency rather than any genuine claim of innocence. Judge Renfield did not take long to deliberate. He returned to the courtroom within the hour, his expression grim and final. "Wendell Cross," he said, "this court finds you guilty on all counts of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit arson against a federal witness. Given the extensive pattern of similar conduct documented across multiple territories, this court sees no basis for leniency in sentencing." He looked out over the packed courtroom at the gathered ranchers who had risked everything to bring this truth to light. You are sentenced to 15 years in the territorial penitentiary and ordered to make full restitution to every rancher whose water rights or property you fraudulently obtained, restoring their claims in full and compensating them for damages incurred, including the deliberate destruction of Mr. Foster's barn. The courtroom erupted into a mixture of relieved tears and quiet, disbelieving joy, ranchers embracing each other in the aisles, months and years of quiet fear and stolen dignity finally publicly vindicated. Abigail felt Caleb's arms come around her, both of them overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what had just been accomplished, not just their own ranch saved, but an entire valley's worth of stolen water and stolen trust, finally, formally restored. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "Caleb, it's actually truly over. It's over." He agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He made no effort to hide. "And it's over because you refused to let fear win from the very first moment you stood in that street against Beatrice Ashford's cruelty, straight through to standing beside every rancher in this valley when they needed someone brave enough to lead the way." As bailiffs led Wendell Cross from the courtroom in shackles, Abigail caught his eyes one final time across the room and found none of the cold, calculating menace that had unsettled her weeks before. Only the hollow, diminished look of a man whose careful schemes had finally completely unraveled under the combined weight of honest testimony and long overdue courage. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, not exactly. What she felt instead was something quieter and more profound. The simple, settled knowledge that truth, however long delayed, however fiercely resisted, had finally won out over cruelty and greed. The wedding took place 4 days later under a sky so achingly blue it seemed almost designed for the occasion, in the wide grassy field behind Thornton Ranch, where Caleb had once promised to build Abigail a proper garden. Nearly every rancher from the valley attended, along with most of Amber Creek's townsfolk, the community bond forged through their shared fight against Cross, now extending naturally into shared celebration of the love that had, in its own quiet way, helped inspire their collective courage. Abigail stood at the edge of the gathered crowd in a dress she'd made herself from fabric, gifted by the ranch wives who had become her friends, her mother's hairpins carefully placed in hair that Cora surprisingly, tearfully present, after all having ridden up with Jonah, and even awkwardly. Silas had helped arrange that morning with a gentleness Abigail hadn't experienced from her sister-in-law in 15 years of knowing her. "I know I've got no right asking for your forgiveness," Cora had said quietly, hands trembling slightly as she worked through Abigail's hair. "Not after everything. But I wanted you to know, watching what you built here, watching this whole valley rally around you and Caleb, it's made me ashamed of every unkind word I ever let pass without objecting to it. I'm sorry, Abby, truly." Abigail hadn't offered easy absolution. The wounds of 15 years didn't dissolve simply because circumstances had finally shifted. But she'd allowed the apology to stand unrejected, a small door left open for whatever slow rebuilding might come after in its own time, if it came at all. "Thank you for saying it," she'd said simply. "That's a start at least." Preacher Coleman, having arrived on his circuit exactly as hoped, stood now at the front of the gathered crowd, and Abigail felt her heart pounding as Otis, standing in as her escort in the absence of any father to walk her forward, offered his arm with visible pride. "Ready, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, grinning. "Last chance to run for it, though. I'd wager you'd have to outrun half the valley trying to stop you." "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Abigail said. The walk toward Caleb felt both impossibly long and impossibly brief. Every face in the gathered crowd, Otis Dutch, the Fosters, even Beatrice Ashford, dabbing at genuine tears, blurring together into a warm, overwhelming impression of a community that had, against every expectation Abigail had carried into this valley weeks before, come to genuinely embrace her. And then there was Caleb, standing tall and solid at the front of it all, dressed in his best coat, his eyes never once leaving her face as she approached, an expression of such open, undisguised love that Abigail felt tears rising before she'd even reached him. "You look," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion, "like every good thing I never let myself hope for. Save your poetry for the vows, Mr. Thornton. Preacher Coleman said, though his own eyes looked suspiciously bright as he said it. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of overwhelming emotion. Vows, spoken with trembling voices and steady conviction. Caleb's mother's ring finally permanently settled onto Abigail's finger. The preacher's declaration that they were now officially entirely husband and wife met with a roar of celebration from the assembled crowd that startled every horse within a mile of the ranch. "You may kiss your bride," Preacher Coleman announced, and Caleb didn't hesitate, pulling Abigail close and kissing her with a tenderness and certainty that erased, in that single moment, 15 years of believing herself unworthy of exactly this kind of joy. The celebration that followed stretched long into the golden evening tables, laden with food, contributed by nearly every household in the valley. Music from a fiddle and guitar drawing dancers into the grass well past sundown. Laughter and gratitude and hard-won relief, mingling together into something that felt to Abigail like the truest kind of homecoming she had ever experienced. She found herself at one point standing slightly apart from the celebration with Silas, an awkward silence stretching between them that neither seemed quite certain how to fill. "You did right," Silas said finally, testifying and standing up to cross and building all this. He gestured vaguely at the celebration around them. "I know I've got no claim to any pride in it, but I'm proud of you anyway, Abby. Whatever that's worth coming from me." "It's worth something," Abigail said carefully. "Not everything, but something." Silas nodded, accepting the qualified grace without argument. "I mean to do better," he said. "Don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I mean to try. Starting with not letting Jonah talk me into any more of his convenient blindness whenever something feels wrong." "That would be a start," Abigail agreed, and found to her own surprise that she meant it not full forgiveness, not yet, but the genuine hope that her brother might slowly become someone worth eventually forgiving. Caleb found her a few minutes later, pulling her gently away from the lingering weight of that conversation, and into the dancing instead, his hand warm and steady at her waist as they moved together under the darkening sky. "You did something remarkable today," he murmured against her hair. "Not just marrying me. Extending grace to people who've given you precious little reason to offer it." "I learned that from you," Abigail said. "Watching you stand up for me against Mrs. Ashford, against Dutch, against my own brother. I learned that strength and grace aren't opposites. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is choose grace anyway, even when cruelty would be easier, even when it's been earned." The weeks that followed the wedding settled into a rhythm of quiet, hard-won happiness that Abigail had never quite dared imagine for herself. Wendell Cross's promised restitution, though slow in its full legal processing, began returning stolen water rights to rancher after rancher across the valley, transforming dry, struggling pastures back into the productive land they'd once been. Old Man Foster's new barn, built with the combined labor of nearly every rancher in the valley, stood taller and sturdier than the one that had burned a physical testament to the community bonds forged through shared struggle. Dolly, the injured mare whose panic during that fateful thunderstorm had first revealed to Caleb the full depth of Abigail's courage, healed completely. Her limp entirely gone by the time autumn's first cool mornings arrived, and Abigail took to riding her regularly across the ranch's rolling pastures, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in the span of a single summer. "3 months ago," she said to Caleb one evening, the two of them sitting together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I was standing on my brother's porch being told I was a joke nobody wanted to keep. Now, I'm sitting here married to a man who fought a valley-wide conspiracy, partly to protect me, surrounded by neighbors who've become genuine friends, watching a sunset over land that finally truly feels like home." She shook her head, still faintly disbelieving. "I don't know how a person's whole life changes so completely in such a short span of time." "Maybe it's not so much that your life changed completely," Caleb said, threading his fingers through hers, "as that you finally found yourself somewhere that let you become who you'd always actually been, underneath everything your family spent 15 years trying to convince you wasn't there. The courage, the strength, the capacity for love freely given without needing to earn it first." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "That was always in you, Abigail. This valley, this life, it just finally gave it room to breathe. Abigail leaned into him, feeling the truth of his words settle deep and warm in her chest, and watched the last light fade behind the mountains that had, against every expectation she'd carried on that long, frightened train journey west, become the truest home she had ever known. Autumn deepened into the ranch's busiest season, and Abigail found herself fully immersed in the rhythms of ranch life, helping manage the herd through the seasonal drives, preserving the harvest from the garden. She'd finally gotten her fence built around, hosting the growing circle of friends who now considered Thornton Ranch a welcome gathering place, rather than the isolated bachelors holding it had once been. Dutch, whose redemption had continued steadily since his honest testimony at the trial, had earned back Caleb's full trust through months of diligent, honest work, and had recently begun courting one of the foster daughters with a shy earnestness that made Otis tease him mercilessly at every opportunity. "Never thought I'd see the day," Otis remarked one evening, watching Dutch's obvious nervousness as he prepared for a supper visit to the Foster homestead. "Boy went from selling secrets for saloon money to blushing over a girl's smile in under 6 months. Reckon there's hope for anybody given enough reason to want to change." "There usually is," Abigail agreed, thinking of Silas's halting attempts at genuine reform, of the careful, tentative letters he'd begun sending her every few weeks. Small updates about his life that asked for nothing in return, except perhaps the slow rebuilding of a relationship neither of them had thought worth saving before. It was on a crisp October morning, nearly 3 months after the wedding, that Abigail found herself standing once more at the ridge overlooking the valley, where Caleb had first told her he loved her, watching the pattern of golden light and shifting shadow move across land that had witnessed both terrible cruelty and remarkable redemption in the span of a single eventful summer. Caleb found her there, as he often did these quiet mornings, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin against her hair. "Deep thoughts this morning?" he asked. "Just grateful ones," Abigail said. "Thinking about everything that happened to bring us here. The barn dance that made me believe I was unworthy of love. My brother's cruel letter that nearly convinced you I wasn't worth the trouble. Wendell Cross's greed that nearly cost us everything we'd built together." She turned in his arms to face him. "It's strange, isn't it? How something as ugly as everything we survived this summer somehow led us here to this exact moment, standing on this exact ridge, more certain of each other and more grateful for this life than either of us had any right to expect." "Maybe that's just how the truest things work," Caleb said. "They don't arrive easy or convenient or without cost. They arrive through fire, through fear, through folks brave enough to stand up and say the truth mattered more than their own comfort or safety." He cupped her face gently in his weathered hands. "I don't regret a single hard moment of this summer, Abigail, painful as parts of it were. Every bit of it led me here to you, to this life we're building together. I wouldn't trade that for an easier road that led somewhere less true." Abigail felt tears rise, happy ones this time, and let them fall freely as she pressed her forehead against his. "I love you, Caleb Thornton," she said. "Completely, without reservation. Exactly as fiercely as you've loved me since the very first moment you took my suitcase from that train platform and looked at me like I was already exactly enough." "You were always exactly enough," Caleb said. "The whole world just needed time to finally see it plain." They stood together on that ridge a long while, the valley spread golden and thriving. Below them the mountains, standing eternal and steady at their backs. Two people who had each in their own separate griefs and separate cruelties endured, given up on believing they deserved this particular kind of quiet, hard-won happiness, and had found it anyway, against every discouraging expectation in each other in this valley, in a love built not on convenience or desperation, but on the deep, abiding respect of two people who had chosen again and again through every trial and every triumph to stand fully and unflinchingly beside one another. The woman who had once stood trembling on her brother's porch, clutching a suitcase, held shut with rope, believing herself unworthy of any love at all, had become instead the beating heart of a mountain ranch, the trusted friend of an entire valley's worth of neighbors, and the cherished, fiercely loved wife of a man who had never once from that very first meeting on a dusty train platform seen her as anything less than exactly completely enough. She was not the joke her family had made her out to be. She had never been unwanted at all. She had simply been waiting through every cruel word and every lonely year for the one place and the one person capable of finally truly seeing her. And in Caleb Thornton's steady, unwavering love, in this valley's hard-won peace in the family and home she had built from nothing but her own quiet courage, Abigail Whitmore had found exactly that. And she would carry that certainty, that unshakable knowledge of her own worth for every remaining day of the beautiful hard-won life still waiting to unfold before her.